Horace Bellweather slammed his fist on the dining table so hard the soup bowls jumped. "I don't care what she thinks she saw," he said, pointing one thick finger at the housekeeper standing in the doorway. "You tell that schoolteacher to stay out of my affairs, or I will have her on the next stage back to Philadelphia before she finishes her morning coffee." He reached across and snatched the letter from the housekeeper's hand, the letter Clara had written to the county attorney, the one she'd asked Mrs. Pruitt to mail in secret, and tore it in half without reading past the first line. Then he looked up and smiled, the way a man smiles when he has already decided how something is going to end. "The children are mine to manage," he said quietly. "And anyone who forgets that is going to find out exactly what that means. If you've ever watched someone in Power Crush a child's voice without blinking, then you already understand why this story matters. If this is your first time here, welcome, subscribe now, and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will shake you. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels." The stage from San Antonio arrived at Red Mesa, crossing 3 hours behind schedule, which meant Lenora Whitfield had been sitting on a hard wooden bench at the relay station since 2:30 in the afternoon, watching dust devils spin across a scrubland she had never imagined could stretch so wide. She had a trunk, a leather satchel, 2 teaching certificates rolled in a cardboard tube, and exactly $11.40 in her coin purse, the remainder of what she'd carried from Philadelphia after 3 weeks of travel by rail, riverboat, and now this lurching stagecoach that smelled permanently of horse sweat and old leather. She was 27 years old. She had taught in a cramped Philadelphia classroom for 4 years. She had never been west of Pittsburgh. The man who met her at the crossing was not Horace Bellweather. It was a ranch hand named Gil, short and bow-legged, who chewed tobacco continuously and spoke in half-sentences while loading her trunk onto a buckboard wagon. He told her the ride to Red Mesa Ranch was about 2 hours. He told her the children were Clara and Toby, 11 and 8. He told her Mr. Bellweather was a busy man and that she'd get her instructions when she arrived. He did not tell her anything about Darius Reddick. The ranch revealed itself slowly as they came over a long rise in the land, a wide compound of buildings, a main house with a covered porch, a long bunkhouse, several outbuildings, corrals stretching in both directions. It was bigger than she'd expected, more permanent, like something that had been planted in the earth and grown into whatever shape it wanted. Gil pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the main house, climbed down, and called for someone to take the trunk. Then he disappeared around the back of the bunkhouse without another word, leaving Lenora standing in the yard with her satchel, looking at a porch where nobody had come out to greet her. She waited. A dog watched her from beneath a water trough. 2 ranch hands crossed the yard behind her and didn't look her direction. Then the front door opened, and Horace Bellweather came out. He was not what she'd imagined from his letters. The letters had been formal, precise, businesslike. She had pictured a lean man behind a desk. But Horace was broad through the chest and shoulders, going soft at the middle now, with a silver-streaked mustache and the kind of comfortable confidence that comes from years of being the largest landowner in a room. He shook her hand once, firmly, and told her she looked tired from the road. "Come inside," he said. "I'll have someone bring tea." The parlor was well furnished in the way that suggested money spent carefully rather than freely, everything solid and functional, nothing ornamental, except for a large cattle brand mounted on the wall above the fireplace. Horace sat across from her in a leather chair and studied her the way a man evaluates a piece of equipment he has just purchased. "Your references were excellent," he said. "Mrs. Calloway in Philadelphia spoke very highly of your discipline and your patience." "I appreciate that," Lenora said. "I'm very much looking forward to working with Clara and Toby. Your letter mentioned they have strong foundational skills, but have missed consistent instruction since their parents passed." Horace nodded slowly. "That's part of it," he said. "Part of it?" He set down his cup. He looked at her steadily. "I want to be direct with you, Miss Whitfield. The children's education is important to me. Their future is important to me. But there is another matter on this ranch that requires, shall we say, a particular kind of influence." She waited. "My foreman," Horace said, "Darius Reddick." The name did not mean anything to her yet. It would. He has been with this ranch for 9 years, Horace continued. He is effective with cattle and with difficult terrain. He is also the most feared man in this county, and not without reason. He has driven away 3 ranch foremen before him, 7 ranch hands this year alone, and every governess or tutor I have hired for the children over the past 2 years has quit within a month of his interference. Interference, Lenora repeated carefully. He inserts himself into the children's lives in ways that are inappropriate for a ranch hand. He contradicts instruction, undermines routine, and creates an atmosphere of fear for anyone who tries to do their job properly. Horace picked up his cup again. I need a teacher who can establish authority and maintain it, even in the presence of a man who does not believe women or schoolbooks belong on a working cattle ranch. Lenora looked at him. You want me to civilize him? Horace smiled slightly. I want you to do your job so effectively that his objections become irrelevant. It sounded reasonable. It was only later, lying awake in the small room off the kitchen that had been assigned to her, listening to the sounds of the ranch, settling into night, the cattle shifting, the wind through the fence posts, the distant sound of boots crossing the bunkhouse porch, that she began to feel the particular discomfort of a woman who has agreed to something she hasn't fully understood yet. She met the children the next morning. Clara came down the stairs first, precise and self-contained for 11, dark-haired, serious-eyed, carrying a book already, which Lenora found immediately encouraging. She shook Lenora's hand like a small adult and said, I've had 4 teachers. They all left because of Darius. Clara, Horace said from the doorway. It's true, Clara said, not unkindly, just factually. I'm not blaming him. I'm just telling her what happened so she's not surprised. Toby came down sideways, clinging to the banister, watching Lenora from the bottom step with 8-year-old suspicion. He had his sister's dark hair and something else in his face, something more vulnerable and less protected than Clara's careful composure. He did not shake Lenora's hand. He said, Do you know about horses? Not very much, Lenora admitted. He considered this. Darius says most people don't know enough about horses, and that's why they get hurt by them. Toby, Horace said more firmly. He also says, That's enough. Toby went quiet, but he didn't look embarrassed. He looked at Lenora with something that might have been a measurement, like he was comparing what he saw to a standard she didn't know yet. She spent her first full day establishing the schoolroom in a converted sitting room off the main hall, organizing her books and materials, introducing the children to her expectations and her methods. Clara engaged carefully and honestly, asking questions that were sharper than most adults would have ventured. Toby sat and listened and said almost nothing, but his eyes tracked everything. It was good work, the kind of first day she had hoped for. Darius Reddick walked past the schoolroom window 3 times without stopping. She saw him on the second pass, a big shape moving with an unhurried purpose that somehow managed to feel like everything was getting out of his way. She did not go to the window. She kept teaching. On the 3rd pass, he stopped. The window was open 6 inches against the afternoon heat. She heard him stop, no footsteps, just the sudden absence of them, and then she heard him say, not loudly, aimed at no one in particular, they're going to learn to read about farming, or they're going to forget how to do it. Clara looked up from her reader. Lenora said, without turning from the blackboard, they're going to learn both. A long pause. Then the footsteps resumed, unhurried as before. Clara stared at the window, then at Lenora. Nobody talks back to him, she said. I didn't talk back to him, Lenora said. I answered him. She met him properly, if that was the right word, the following morning. She had risen early to take her coffee on the porch before the day heated up, and he was already in the yard, talking to 2 ranch hands in a low voice while pointing toward the northern fence line. When he turned and saw her, he didn't adjust his expression or his posture. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at something he's already made a decision about. He was large in a way that took a moment to fully register, not just tall but substantial, with the kind of scarring on his forearms and along the left side of his jaw that told a story of years doing dangerous work in unforgiving places. His eyes were a very light gray that she hadn't expected. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been in a fight with the land itself and had not entirely won. Miss Whitfield, he said. Not a question, not a greeting. Just an acknowledgement that she existed, and he knew it. Mr. Reddick. He looked at her for a moment, Then he said, "You know what he told you about me?" "Mr. Bellweather told me about your reputation," she said. And? And I don't make judgments about people based on other people's opinions. Something shifted in his expression, not softening, exactly. More like the slight adjustment of a man who was told something he expected to be a lie, but cannot quite confirm it is. "That's a careful thing to say," he said. "It's an honest thing to say," she said. He held her gaze for another 2 seconds, she counted, afterward, because it felt like much longer, and then he turned back to the ranch hands and resumed his instructions without another word in her direction. She went back inside. Her coffee had gone cold. The first real collision came 4 days in. She had set up an afternoon lesson, Clara and Toby, working through a passage from a history reader about westward settlement when the sound of hooves drew Toby to the window. Below, in the yard, Darius was working a young horse in the round pen, and Toby pressed his face against the glass with the helpless attention of a child who has already decided where his heart belongs. "Toby," Lenora said, "come back to the passage." "He's gentling the chestnut," Toby said without turning. "She's been spooked all week. He's the only one she'll let near her." "That's very interesting," Lenora said evenly, "and I'm sure there will be time to watch later. But right now we have work to finish." Toby came back to the table. He sat. He looked at the page and did not read it. Clara read her section aloud with practiced neatness. Toby read his with the halting effort of a boy whose mind was clearly still in the round pen. Lenora corrected his pace and asked him a comprehension question. He answered it wrong. Again, she said gently. "I know this," he said, frustrated. I can't think about it right now." "Why not?" He looked up. "Because the chestnut is scared, and Darius is trying to reach her, and I know exactly what he's doing, and I want to watch." She looked at him. "Tell me what he's doing." Toby blinked. That wasn't what he'd expected. "What?" "Explain to me what Darius is doing with the horse." "Walk me through it." Toby turned in his chair, looked out the window, turned back. His face changed, the helpless distraction replaced by something sharper. "He's not pushing her," he said. "He's not chasing her around. He's standing still, right in the middle, and he's letting her decide how close she wants to get. Because if you push a scared horse, she gets more scared. But if you wait her out, she figures out eventually that you're not dangerous." Lenora nodded slowly. "That's actually a very clear explanation of earning trust through patience rather than force." Toby stared at her. "Yeah, which is also what I just read in this passage," she said, setting her finger on the page. "About how settlers approaching new territory had to read the land before they could work it. Not force it. Read it first." She slid the passage toward him. "Now read it again, and tell me if that sounds different." He read it. His face changed again, less resistant, more genuinely interested. Clara was watching Lenora with something that wasn't quite suspicion and wasn't quite trust, but was actively becoming one or the other. Darius watched from the round pen fence that evening as Lenora walked the children back across the yard after a long day. She did not look at him. She said something that made Clara laugh, an actual laugh, short and surprised, and Toby ran ahead to open the gate for her with a small, uncalculated courtesy that boys his age usually had to be reminded about. Darius looked at the gate for a long moment after they'd gone through. Then he turned back to his horse. The trouble with Horace started sooner than she'd anticipated. She had been at the ranch 11 days when she found the letter. She wasn't snooping. She was looking for additional reading materials in the main house study, where Horace had told her the bookshelves were open to her use. The letter was not hidden, exactly, just tucked between 2 ledger books, and she would have left it alone entirely, except that the letterhead was from the Caldwell Academy in Austin, a school she recognized, and the letter was addressed to Horace. And the words regarding the placement of Clara and Toby Marsh were visible on the first line, before she'd had time to decide not to read it. She did not read it. She put it back exactly where she found it. She found her books and returned to the schoolroom and spent the next hour with the children, but her mind kept returning to those words, placement. Marsh. The children's last name was Marsh Clara and Toby Marsh. Their father had been Edward Marsh, who had died of fever 18 months ago along with their mother, and who had been what? A business associate of Horace's? A friend? She hadn't been given specifics. Placement. Caldwell Academy in Austin. That was 200 miles away. That evening after supper, She asked Horace, carefully, and without mentioning the letter, whether he had long-term plans for the children's schooling. He looked at her with the smooth patience of a man who is prepared for a question. Clara and Toby deserve the finest education available, he said. I am looking into options for when they are a bit older. I see, she said. What kind of timeline were you imagining? Nothing imminent, he said. You needn't worry yourself. He changed the subject to the cattle market with the confident ease of a man who has been changing subjects for 40 years. She let him, but she watched his hands, and his hands were too still. She found Darius alone at the water trough the next morning before the ranch hands were up. This was unusual, he was always working by this hour, but he was standing with his back to the main house, drinking coffee from a tin cup. And he turned when he heard her boots on the gravel, with an alertness that was not startled, just immediately present. Can I ask you something? She said. He looked at her. You're going to ask it either way. The children's father, she said. Edward Marsh. What was his relationship to Horace Bellweather? Something changed in Darius's face, not dramatically. Just a slight settling, like a man who has been expecting a door to open and is now watching it swing. Business partner, he said. 10 years. They ran cattle together before Bellweather bought him out. Was it a good buyout? Darius looked at his coffee cup. Marsh thought so at the time, and afterward, a long pause. Marsh didn't say much about it to me, but I knew Edward Marsh for 12 years, and the last 3 of them he was a worried man. Worried in the way men get when they've signed something they can't unsign. Do you know what he signed? Darius looked at her with those gray eyes that held still even when everything else in a man moved. I know what he told me before he died, he said. I know what he asked me to do. Which was? He didn't answer immediately. He looked out past the corrals toward the northern fence line, the way men in open country look out at distance when they need a moment. Then he said, he asked me to make sure his children were all right. And are they? The silence that followed that question was long enough that a hawk passed overhead and was gone before he spoke. Not yet, he said. She held his gaze. He held hers. All right, she said finally. Then we need to talk. He looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't quite done before, which was different from the measuring looks she'd gotten in those first days. This was more like a man reassessing a map he thought he understood. You found something, he said. A letter, she said. I didn't read it past the letterhead, but I read enough. Caldwell Academy. She stared. You already knew. I've known for 6 weeks. His voice was flat, just stating fact. He's been arranging it since January. Clara and Toby gone to Austin by fall. Proper schooling, proper society, proper connections for when they're old enough to be useful. Useful for what? Darius looked at her with something that was close to patience, but was actually more like resignation, the expression of a man who has understood an unpleasant thing for long enough that explaining it to someone else has become its own kind of weariness. Marsh's estate, he said. What's left of it? Bellweather's been managing it since Edward died. Managing it means controlling it. And Clara and Toby's social position, if they're placed right, educated right, connected right, that's worth something to certain people. Worth something to Horace, you mean. To Horace and to the men he does business with. She stood there in the early morning light and let the full shape of it settle on her. He's going to send them away, she said. Not for their sake. No, Darius said simply. Not for their sake. And you can't stop him. He didn't answer. That was its own answer. She looked at the main house, its solid walls and covered porch, the permanence of it. There has to be a legal mechanism, she said. Something in their father's estate. Some named guardian, some provision. There is, Darius said. She turned back to him. His face was very still. Edward Marsh made a will, he said. Proper legal document drawn up by an attorney in San Antonio. Named a primary guardian for the children in the event he and his wife died. Who? She said, though she was already suspecting. Me, said Darius Reddick. The silence after that was the kind that changes rooms. She heard a horse shift in the corral. She heard the wind in the fence posts. She stood there looking at this large, scarred, feared man with the tin cup and the gray eyes, and she thought about Clara saying, nobody talks back to him, and Toby explaining trust with the certainty of a boy who had learned it from someone who meant it. Horace has the document, Darius said. He's had it since Edward died. He has never filed it or disclosed it Because if he does, he loses control of the children and everything connected to them, and you haven't been able to get it back. He had the county judge in his pocket for 2 years. That judge retired in March. He looked at her steadily. New judge came in April. She took a slow breath. You need evidence, she said. You need the attorney who drew up the will. Vicente Aguilar, he said, San Antonio. Calls in Banning Street. She stared at him. You know the man's address. I've known it for 14 months, Darius said. I didn't have anyone I could trust to go there without Bellweather, finding out before the week was over. She understood what he was saying. She stood there in the growing light of a Texas morning that smelled of dry grass and livestock and the particular dusty clarity of open space. And she looked at this man who had been described to her as dangerous and uncivilized and in need of taming. And she thought about the fact that for 14 months he had been quietly waiting for someone trustworthy to walk through the gate. I'm a schoolteacher from Philadelphia, she said. I know what you are, he said. I've never been to San Antonio. I know that too. If Horace finds out I've gone there on your behalf, he'll fire you, Darius said. Or worse, he'll have the documents disappeared before you get back and deny everything. She nodded slowly. So I'd need to go without telling him why. You'd need to go like a woman who wants to spend a few days in a city, he said. See the mission. Buy some books. Whatever reason a schoolteacher would have for making the trip. And then I'd need to find an attorney I've never met and ask him to confirm a legal document that his client's business associate has been suppressing for over a year. She paused. What if he won't talk to me? Darius reached into his shirt pocket. He took out a folded piece of paper and held it out to her. She took it and unfolded it. It was a letter, handwritten, dated 14 months ago, Edward Marsh's handwriting, though she didn't know that yet. It was addressed to Vicente Aguilar. It said, If Darius Reddick sends someone to you and they carry this letter, tell them what you know. Trust them as you trusted me. She read it twice. Then she folded it again and held it. He sent that to you, she said. 3 days before he died, Darius said. He knew he was sick. He knew how it might go. His voice didn't waver, but there was something underneath it, not softness, exactly, but the particular weight of a grief that has been carried quietly for a long time. He trusted me with his children, and I have not been able to do what I said I would do. Lenora looked at the letter in her hand. She looked at the man in front of her. When can I leave? She said. Something moved across Darius Reddick's face, a brief and complicated thing that was not quite relief and not quite gratitude, but held both inside it like a lamp behind thick glass. Tomorrow, he said. Gil can get you to the stage crossing before Bellweather's up. Tomorrow, she agreed. She turned and walked back toward the house. She was 12 feet away when he spoke again, quietly, not calling after her, but just saying it to the morning air. You are not what I expected. She didn't stop walking. Neither are you, she said. Inside the house, in the schoolroom, Clara was already sitting at her desk with a book open, the history reader, the one about westward settlement, and looked up when Lenora came through the door. You were talking to Darius, Clara said. I was, Lenora said, sitting at her desk. Clara studied her. Most people who talk to Darius come back looking rattled. I'm not rattled. I can see that. Clara tilted her head. What were you talking about? Your father, Lenora said, which was true enough. Clara went very quiet. She looked down at her book. Then she said, without looking up, Darius doesn't talk about our father to most people. He doesn't think most people deserve to hear about him. Why do you think he talked to me? Clara considered this for a long moment with the careful seriousness of a girl who thought before she spoke. Because you answered him through the window, she said finally. That first day. You answered him instead of ignoring him or being scared of him. He noticed that. Does he notice things like that? He notices everything, Clara said. He just doesn't let on. She paused. He says most people worth knowing are quiet about what they see. Lenora looked at her. Your father sounds like he was a wise man, she said. To trust someone like that. Clara's expression shifted, the self-contained composure going thinner. For just a moment, the way ice thin in early spring, before she steadied it again. He was the best man I knew, she said, and Darius was his best friend. I believe that, Lenora said. She opened her own book, which she didn't read. She sat with those words in the Texas morning and thought about 14 months and a folded letter and a man standing at a water trough in the dark waiting for someone trustworthy to arrive. Outside the window, Darius moved through the yard with his unhurried purpose, and the ranch hands stepped aside without thinking about it, and the chestnut mare in the round pen lifted her head and watched him come. Toby appeared at the schoolroom door, breathless from running. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "can we do our numbers outside today?" Darius said the chestnut is finally letting people close, and I thought maybe. "Sit down, Toby," Lenora said. "We have 3 hours of work first." He came in and sat down with the resigned dignity of a boy accepting a consequence. He opened his arithmetic book and pulled out his pencil. After 3 hours, Lenora said, without looking up from her own papers, "We will go to the round pen." Toby's head came up. "And you will explain to me," she continued, "everything Darius has taught you about reading a horse." In writing, with complete sentences, he stared at her. "That's a lesson too," she said. He bent over his arithmetic book, and she could see, even from across the room, that he was smiling. Gil had the wagon ready before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, which meant Lenora had approximately 40 minutes to get her bag, leave a note for the children explaining she would return by Friday, and appear in the yard looking like a woman who had simply decided to spend a few days, seeing San Antonio, not like a woman carrying a dead man's letter to an attorney who could dismantle everything Horace. Bellweather had been building for 14 months. She managed it, barely. Horace was not up, she had counted on that. But as Gil turned the wagon onto the main track heading south, she looked back once at the ranch compound, and in the gray pre-dawn, she could see a single figure standing near the round pen fence. Still, watching the wagon go, she turned back around and faced south and did not look back again. The stage to San Antonio took most of 2 days, with an overnight stop at a relay station that smelled of old grease and unwashed wool. Lenora sat in the corner of the coach and read, or tried to read, because reading was the only thing that kept her from cataloging every way this plan could collapse. The other passengers were a drummer selling hardware supplies, a stout woman visiting her married daughter, and a young cattle buyer who tried to make conversation for the first hour, and then gave up with admirable speed when she answered his questions in complete sentences that somehow managed to contain no information at all. She arrived in San Antonio on a Wednesday afternoon in late April, found a boarding house 2 blocks from the main plaza, paid for 3 nights, and spent the remainder of the day walking the streets, with her hands in her coat pockets and Edward Marsh's letter folded against her chest. Calls and Banning Street was a narrow block near the courthouse. The office of Vicente Aguilar, attorney at law, occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building with a painted wooden sign and a door that needed a new hinge. She stood across the street for 10 minutes. She watched 2 men go in, 1 come out. Then she crossed the street and went through the door. The man behind the desk was small, 60 or thereabouts, with silver hair and the kind of contained, watchful intelligence that she associated with people who had spent their careers listening carefully to what other people said while tracking what they didn't say. He looked up when she came in and assessed her in approximately 2 seconds. "Can I help you?" he said. She reached inside her coat and placed Edward Marsh's letter on the desk in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at her. He reached out and unfolded it. She watched his face while he read. It was a disciplined face, a professional face, but the letter did something to it, a brief compression around the eyes, a settling at the mouth, like a man hearing music he had not expected from that direction. He read it twice. Then he set it down flat on the desk and folded his hands over it. "Where is Darius Reddick?" he said. "Red Mesa Ranch," she said. "He can't come himself. Bellweather would know before he reached the city limits." Aguilar looked at her steadily. "Who are you?" "Lenora Whitfield. I'm the children's teacher. How long have you been at the ranch?" 3 weeks. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Edward Marsh was a client of mine for 11 years. He was also a man of exceptional character, which is rarer than you might think in my profession." He looked down at the letter again. "He wrote to me 3 days before he died and told me what he'd done. That Darius Reddick was named guardian, that Horace Bellweather would fight it." He paused. "He asked me to be ready." "Are you ready?" she said. Aguilar looked up at her. "I have been ready for 14 months, he said, "waiting for exactly what you just put on my desk." She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. What followed was 3 hours that Lenora would remember for the rest of her life, not for their drama, but for their precision. Aguilar pulling files, explaining the legal framework, detailing what documents Darius would need to present, and to whom. The will was registered in his files, properly witnessed and signed. Aguilar had kept a certified copy against exactly this possibility. Bellweather's failure to disclose, it was not merely improper, it crossed into territory that could be characterized in court as deliberate suppression of a legal instrument, with consequences for his management of the Marsh estate. "He's been managing the estate," Aguilar said, not as a question. "Apparently," Lenora said. "The children's inheritance. What's left of it." Aguilar's expression did not change dramatically. It just went a little colder. "How old are the children now?" "Clara is 11. Toby is 8. Edward's plan was for Reddick to hold guardianship until Clara was of age to decide for herself and Toby was established," Aguilar said. "The estate, even diminished, is enough to give them choices." He looked at her. "Bellweather knows this. He's arranged to send them to a boarding school in Austin by fall," she said. "Placement." Those were the words on the letterhead. Aguilar set down his pen. He was quiet for a moment that had weight in it. "He's moving faster than I expected," he said finally. "Which means Reddick needs to move faster too." She took the documents Aguilar prepared for her certified copies, a signed affidavit of his own testimony regarding the will, a letter to the county court in Red Mesa's jurisdiction outlining the legal standing of Reddick's guardianship claim. She packed them in the bottom of her bag, under her spare dress and her teaching certificates. She spent Thursday visiting the mission and buying books, because that was what the note she'd left explained she was doing, and because if Horace asked Gil what she'd bought in San Antonio, the answer would be 3 volumes of history and a reader on natural science. She arrived back at Red Mesa Crossing on Friday as promised. Darius was not in the yard when Gil brought her in. He was not at the corrals. She went inside, returned the children's greeting. Clara looked at her bag with the particular attention of a girl who notices things and says nothing. Toby had learned to ride a second horse in her absence and needed to tell her about every step of it immediately, and then she changed out of her traveling dress and found a reason to walk to the far end of the main corral just before supper. Darius was there, working a fence post with a mallet. He didn't look up when she came alongside the fence, but he stopped working. "Well," he said. "Aguilar has everything," she said quietly. "He's had a certified copy of the will since Edward died. He has an affidavit ready. He has a letter for the county court." She paused. "He said Bellweather is moving faster than he expected. Austin by fall." Darius hit the post once more with the mallet. He said, "New judge took up his position in April. Name's Hartwell. Came from a circuit court in Dallas. Bellweather doesn't have him yet." "Yet," she said. "These things take time," he said flatly. "I've been watching Bellweather work a room for 9 years. He finds the lever on every man eventually. Then how long do we have?" He looked at the fence line. "Months, maybe. If Hartwell is honest and doesn't owe anyone in this county, we have time to file the petition properly. If he's already been approached." He stopped. He set the mallet on the fence rail. "I need to file before Bellweather sends the children anywhere. Once they're gone, getting them back through a court is harder." "What do you need from me?" He looked at her sideways, that gray-eyed assessment that she was getting more used to but still found slightly unsettling, for reasons she hadn't fully examined. "Nothing yet," he said. "I need to get to the courthouse without Bellweather knowing. That's harder for me than it was for you. Can you trust Gil?" "Far as I can throw the wagon," he said. "No. Any of the hands?" "2, he said. "Maybe. Pete Odom, who's been here 7 years and doesn't like Bellweather, but doesn't dislike him enough to risk anything. And a new man named Foster, who I'm not sure about yet." She thought for a moment. "If you went during a cattle drive." "Bellweather goes on the drives," Darius said. "That's when he'd know I wasn't where I was supposed to be." "What about the northern boundary issue? You said cattle have been disappearing." He looked at her more directly. "What about it? If you had reason to ride north on ranch business to investigate, to speak with the neighboring ranchers, would Bellweather expect you to report back within a specific time?" A pause, 2-3 days. He'd want me back inside 4. "San Antonio is how far?" "Hard 2-day ride." She looked at him. He looked at her. "That's tight," he said. "Very," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You're better at this than I thought you'd be. I'm a teacher, she said. Planning around obstacles is what I do. He almost smiled. It was not a large expression, just a brief adjustment at one corner of his mouth, but she noted it the way she noted things, quietly and without making it obvious. Cattle have been going missing along the north fence for 6 weeks, he said. I've been putting off dealing with it because Bellweather wants me to deal with it by going over there with 3 armed men making a point. I don't think that's what happened to the cattle, and I don't think that's how it should be handled. What do you think happened? Fence failure, most likely. The creek floods every spring and takes out the boundary markers on the low section. Our cattle drift. Their cattle drift. Nobody's stealing anything, they just need to be counted and sorted. He glanced toward the main house. But Bellweather wants an enemy, so he sees one. Ride north next week, she said. Go slowly. Handle the fence problem the right way. Come back through San Antonio and file the petition. He looked at her for a long moment. If he finds out. He won't find out from me, she said. He nodded once, slowly, like a man adding weight to one side of a scale and watching it settle. Then he picked up the mallet and went back to the fence post, and she walked back toward the main house in the last of the afternoon light. What she had not anticipated was Horace. He found her that evening after supper, in the parlor, where she was correcting the children's written work from the week. He came in and closed the door, which he had not done before, and she felt the change in the room, immediately the slight drop in temperature that has nothing to do with air. Good trip? He said. Very pleasant, she said, without looking up from Clara's essay. The mission is remarkable. I found 3 excellent volumes on natural history that should serve the children well. 3 volumes, he said. Expensive, I budgeted carefully. She made a correction on Clara's paper. The children did very well this week, from what I can see in their work. Miss Whitfield. His voice shifted slightly, not threatening, just more deliberate. Did you go anywhere in San Antonio besides the mission and the bookshops? She looked up then, because not looking up would have been the tell. She met his eyes with the steady calm of a woman who has had 11 days to watch this man manage information and has learned exactly what he does with it. I walked around the plaza, she said. Had coffee at a cafe near the courthouse. Spent one evening at the boarding house reading. She tilted her head slightly. Is there something specific you're concerned about? He looked at her. He was very good at this, the long, weighted look that was designed to make people fill the silence with things they shouldn't say. She had seen him use it on the ranch hands. She did not fill the silence. No, he said finally. Just making conversation. He moved toward the door. I hope you found what you were looking for. I did, she said, and returned to Clara's essay. She did not hear him leave. She heard the door close. Her hand, holding the pen, was completely steady. She was slightly proud of that. The following week was tense in the way of things that have been set in motion, but haven't landed yet, everything continuing its surface routine, while something underneath ran fast and unseen, like a creek flooding below ground. She taught the children in the mornings and afternoons. She ate meals with Horace and maintained the careful, pleasant neutrality of a professional employee who has no opinions about ranch management. She did not speak to Darius except in passing, and even those exchanges were brief and functional: the weather, the children's progress, nothing that could be read as anything other than the foreman and the teacher crossing paths on a working ranch. Darius rode north on a Tuesday. He told Bellweather the fence situation couldn't wait, that cattle from both sides were mixing and needed sorting before branding season. Horace told him to take 2 armed men. Darius said he'd handle it himself. Sending 3 men to a fence dispute makes it into something it isn't. Horace did not like this, but accepted it, because Darius had been managing cattle situations since before Horace owned the ranch, and Horace knew it. Lenora watched him ride out from the schoolroom window. Clara watched her watch him. You're worried, Clara said. I'm not worried, Lenora said. Open your reader. You've been watching that window all morning, Clara said. Clara, I watch things too, Clara said, in the particular tone of a girl who has been underestimated often enough to be direct about it. I notice when things are happening that nobody's telling me about. She paused. Is it about us? About Toby and me? Lenora looked at her. She thought about what to say, and about what it cost a child to ask a question that plainly. There are some things being worked out, she said carefully. Grown-up things that need time to resolve properly. When there is something to tell you, I will tell you. Clara held her gaze. Does Darius know what's happening? Yes. And you're working with him on it? Clara. Because he's been trying to handle it by himself for a long time, Clara said. And he's not good at asking for help. He's never asked anyone for help in his life, I don't think. Our father used to say that Darius would rather break his own arm than admit he needed someone to open a door for him. Her voice was steady, but something underneath it was not quite steady, the slight unevenness of a girl talking about her dead father's words in a room that was too quiet. He said it like it was a character flaw and a virtue at the same time. Lenora sat down in the chair beside Clara's desk. She didn't teach. She just sat. Your father trusted him completely, she said. I know, Clara said. That's why I trust him. And I'm starting to think... She stopped. She looked at the window, then back. I'm starting to think maybe you're worth trusting, too. It was not a simple thing to say. Lenora understood that. Coming from Clara Marsh, who had watched 4 teachers leave and who understood, at 11 years old, exactly what it meant to be managed by Horace Bellweather, it was the most honest statement of risk she'd heard since Darius had said not yet at the water trough. Thank you, Lenora said quietly. I'm going to try to earn that. Clara nodded once, like a business arrangement concluded. All right, she said. Can we do history now? I want to get through the land ordinances before Toby comes back and derails everything. Lenora laughed, actually laughed, short and genuine, and pulled her chair to the desk. Darius came back on Friday. He came in through the south gate just after noon, which was not the northern route he'd left on, and his horse was lathered from a long push. He went directly to the stable, and Lenora, who had been watching the south gate since Wednesday, waited 30 minutes and then walked to the stable, on the pretext of asking about the chestnut mare that Toby had been worrying over. He was rubbing down his horse when she came through the stable door. He didn't look up. Well, she said, in the same tone he had used at the corrals. Filed, he said. Aguilar came with me himself. We went before Hartwell Thursday morning. She closed her eyes for just a second. And? Hartwell looked at Aguilar's documentation for 20 minutes. Then he looked at me. He paused. He said, and I'm giving you the exact words here, mister. Reddick, if what this document says is accurate, then there are several people in this county who owe you a long conversation and possibly an apology. What does that mean for the timeline? Hartwell is issuing a notice to Bellweather, requiring him to produce the original will or contest its registered copy within 30 days. After that, we go to a hearing, 30 days. She did the math. That puts the hearing before fall, before Caldwell Academy, Darius said. She let out a breath. He went back to rubbing down the horse. She watched him work for a moment, the methodical, deliberate care of a man who does things properly not because he was told to, but because half-done work was its own kind of insult. The fence situation, she said. The northern boundary. Handled, he said. I talked to Frank Pell, who runs the spread next door. His fence crew had the same drainage problem we did. We spent one morning sorting the mixed cattle, split them right, marked the problem section for repair on both sides. No guns, no shouting, 4 hours of work. He paused. Pell shook my hand and asked me why we'd waited 6 weeks. What did you tell him? That we'd had some disagreement on approach, he said flatly. She almost smiled. And how did you explain going through San Antonio on the way back? Supplies, he said. I bought 400 feet of fence wire and 3 new post sets. Gil's bringing them up in the wagon next week. He glanced at her sideways. Bellweather will be angry that I spent money without asking him first. Is that the worst of his anger? He looked at the horse. No, he said. The worst of it is coming. When that notice arrives from Hartwell's court, everything changes. He set down the brush. He turned and looked at her directly. He's going to come after the children first. Try to move them before the hearing. Then he'll come after me. He'll use everything he has, my reputation, my past, the fact that I have no money and no family name and no formal education. Your past, she said carefully. What does he have? Darius was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that has history in it. I was not always a ranch foreman, he said. Before Red Mesa, before I met Edward Marsh, I made money doing things that were legal but not what you'd call refined. cattle drives that went through disputed territory, debt collection for men whose methods were not gentle. I have been in 3 fights that ended badly for the other man, one of which went before a magistrate. He looked at her steadily. I was not charged, but it was noted he'll use all of it. He'll use all of it, Darius agreed. She thought about this. She thought about Clara saying he's never asked anyone for help in his life. She thought about Horace in the parlor. I hope you found what you were looking for. When the time comes, she said, I will tell the court what I have seen in 3 weeks on this ranch. What the children have shown me, what you have done, and how you have done it. He looked at her. You'd testify if it's needed. Yes. He was quiet. He turned back to the horse, but his hands had stilled on the horse's flank. Bellweather will make it hard for you afterward, he said. If you testify against him, and he still has any authority in this county, he'll make things difficult for you. I'm a schoolteacher from Philadelphia, she said, the same way she'd said it at the water trough. I've been making do with difficult since I was 22. He said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, to the horse's neck more than to her, Edward would have liked you. She didn't know what to do with that, so she filed it away in the particular quiet place where she kept things that mattered more than she was ready to say. I'm going back to the schoolroom, she said. Toby has arithmetic, and he's going to try to negotiate me into letting him spend the hour in here instead. Tell him the chestnut needs rest, Darius said. That won't stop him. No, he agreed. It won't. She was at the stable door when she heard him say, Miss Whitfield. She turned. The fence situation, he said. Pell said to tell you he has a daughter, 8 years old, who hasn't had proper schooling in 2 years. His wife passed last spring. He doesn't have money for a school in town. He paused. He asked if there was any arrangement that could be made. She stared at him. You told Frank Pell about me. I told him the ranch had a teacher, he said carefully. I told him she was good. She stood in the stable doorway and felt something shift in her chest, not dramatically, just a quiet realignment, the way a compass needle settles when it's found its direction. Tell him to bring her by on a Thursday, she said. I'll fold her into the morning lessons. Darius nodded, very slightly. She went back to the schoolroom. On Monday, the legal notice from Judge Hartwell's court arrived at Red Mesa Ranch in a sealed envelope addressed to Horace Bellweather. Lenora was in the yard with the children. They were doing what she had started calling field arithmetic, measuring distances and calculating fencing costs as a practical application of the numbers they'd been doing on paper when she saw the courier ride in. She watched Horace take the envelope on the porch. She watched him open it. She watched his face. Horace Bellweather was a man who controlled his expressions the way a banker controls his ledger, every item in its proper column, nothing showing in the margin. But for 3 full seconds, reading that notice, he looked like a man who has just discovered the floor is not where he put it. Then he looked up. His eyes found Darius first, moving through the corrals. Then they found Lenora. She was watching him openly. She didn't look away, and he held her gaze across the yard with an expression that had gone absolutely still. Toby, kneeling in the dirt with his measuring string, said, Miss Whitfield, I got 47. Clara got 52. One of us is wrong. Check your anchor point, Lenora said, without taking her eyes off Horace. My anchor's fine, Toby said. Then check it again. Horace folded the notice. He went back inside. The door to the main house closed with a sound that was perfectly quiet and somehow very loud. Clara, who had been kneeling with her own string and had not looked up from her measurement the entire time, said in a perfectly even voice, 52 is correct, Toby. You stepped on your string at the 3rd post. Toby looked at his string. I did not. He looked at his string. Okay, I did. Lenora made a note in her teaching book. Her hand was steady. She was beginning to understand that steadiness in the face of Horace Bellweather was the only currency that was going to matter in the weeks ahead, and she intended to have plenty of it. That evening she could hear raised voices from Horace's study, Horace's voice, controlled but pressurized, and a second voice she didn't recognize, probably a ranch hand he was consulting. She could not make out words. She did not try. She sat in the schoolroom and marked papers by lamplight and let the sounds continue without giving them the attention they wanted. Later, when the house had gone quiet, there was a soft knock at her door. She opened it. Clara stood in the hallway in her nightgown, holding a candle, her dark hair loose. She looked very young and very old at the same time. "Something is happening," she said. "Yes," Lenora said. "Something is happening. Is it going to be all right?" Lenora looked at her, this girl who had already lost both parents, who had been managed and positioned, and kept carefully in the dark by a man who saw her as an asset rather than a child, who had decided 3 weeks ago that Lenora might be worth trusting and had not taken that decision back. "I don't know for certain," Lenora said, "but I think so. I think the right people are doing the right things." Clara held the candle. "Darius," she said. "Darius," Lenora confirmed. Clara looked at her for a moment longer. Then she said, "He's been trying to protect us for a long time." "I know, he's not going to stop." "I know that too." Clara nodded once. She turned to go back down the hall. Then she stopped. Without turning around, she said, "Thank you for not lying to me." "I'm not going to start," Lenora said. Clara went back to her room. The candle disappeared down the hall. Lenora closed her door and stood in the dark of the small room and listened to the ranch settle around her, the creak of the house, the distant cattle. The wind through the fence posts, and thought about what 30 days looked like from the inside of a situation like this one. It looked, she thought, like every day would need to be accounted for. She intended to account for them. The 30 days did not pass quietly. Horace Bellweather did not rage. He did not threaten. He did not storm through the house breaking things or fire ranch hands in front of everyone to demonstrate his authority. He did what a man like Horace always did when cornered. He got very calm, very deliberate, and very busy in ways that were hard to see clearly until you understood what direction he was moving. The first thing he did was hire a lawyer of his own. The man arrived from Austin 3 days after the court notice, a tall, dry-voiced attorney named Carver, who wore his suits too neatly for the Texas heat, and who spent 2 hours in Horace's study with the door shut, and came out looking satisfied in the manner of a man who has just been paid well to win something unpleasant. Lenora passed him in the hallway on his way out. He looked at her the way men like him look at women they consider irrelevant to the situation. She held the door open for him with perfect courtesy. The second thing Horace did was start talking to the ranch hands. Not all of them. Not publicly. But she noticed, in the days that followed, that Horace was spending time in the yard and at the corrals in ways he hadn't before, stopping to talk to men he usually passed without acknowledging, asking questions, laughing at things that weren't funny, placing his hand on shoulders. She had seen this behavior in administrators back in Philadelphia, the particular social performance of a man taking inventory of his loyalties before a difficult vote. She mentioned it to Darius on a Wednesday, in the same casual fashion they had developed for exchanging information, brief, peripheral, while appearing to be talking about nothing in particular. He was repairing a bridle at the end of the corral fence. She was walking back from the kitchen garden with a handful of mint for the children's afternoon lesson on plant identification. "He's counting his men," she said, not slowing her walk. "I know," Darius said, not looking up from the bridle. "He's been doing it since Monday. How many does he have?" "Enough to make noise," Darius said. "Not enough to change the legal outcome. The court doesn't care about loyalty counts." She slowed just slightly. "He can't block the hearing through the ranch hands. So what is he actually trying to accomplish?" Darius set the bridle down on the fence rail. He looked at her then, directly. "He's building a story," he said. "For the hearing. He needs witnesses who will say I am not a fit guardian. Men who can speak to my temperament, my history, my methods." He paused. "He's not counting loyalty. He's shopping for testimony." She understood immediately. "He's going to put your reputation on trial." "He's going to try," Darius said. He picked up the bridle again. "The difference between what people have heard about me and what they've seen is wider than he's expecting." She walked on. She wanted to believe that. She mostly did. But the unease she carried through the following days was less about the hearing and more about the children. Clara and Toby had not been told anything. Specific Lenora had held to what she'd told Clara that night in the hallway, that things were being worked out, that there would be something to tell when there was something certain to say. But children absorb the texture of a household the way soil absorbs rain, not always aware it's happening, just quietly saturated by it. And Red Mesa Ranch, in those 2 weeks after the court notice arrived, had a texture that was impossible to mistake. Toby felt it in the animals. He spent more time in the stable and the round pen than he ever had, and he asked Darius increasingly specific questions about the chestnut mare, her feeding, her habits, which of the hands she'd allow near her, in the way that children ask about peripheral things when they're too worried to ask about the real thing. Lenora watched this and did not intervene. Some processing needed room, not direction. Clara felt it differently. She became very precise. Her schoolwork was meticulous to the point of being slightly rigid, every answer complete, every sentence cleanly ended, every paper returned without a single stray mark. She was building a wall out of correctness, which Lenora recognized because she had done it herself at 12 years old, when her father had been ill and she hadn't known how to hold that. She let Clara build her wall. But she also, on a Thursday afternoon, set aside the formal lesson and said, "Tell me about your father." Not what happened to him, just what he was like. Clara looked up from her paper. Toby, who had been pretending not to listen from the corner where he was so supposed to be doing his own reading, put his book down entirely. He was tall, Clara said after a moment. Almost as tall as Darius, but not as wide. He had this laugh. It started quiet, and then got louder than you expected. People always turned around when he laughed, because they thought something interesting must have happened. She paused. He was bad at fixing things around the house. Mama always said he had big hands for a careful man, and small shoulders for anything mechanical. Toby said, he could whistle any bird call, any of them. He taught me the meadowlark. He did, Clara said. Mama said it was his one useless skill. It's not useless, Toby said firmly. That's what he said too. They were quiet for a moment. Lenora let the quiet sit without filling it. He trusted Darius with everything, Clara said finally. He used to say that some men you know for 20 years, and you still can't tell what they'll do in a hard moment. And some men you know for 20 minutes, and you already know. She looked at her paper. He said he knew about Darius in 20 minutes. What did he know? Lenora asked quietly. Clara thought about it. That he would not leave, she said. That he was the kind of man who stays. Lenora sat with that. Toby said very quietly, "Are we going to have to go to Austin?" The room got very still. Lenora looked at him, this 8-year-old boy with his dark hair and his open, undefended face, asking the question he'd been not asking for weeks. "I don't know yet," she said. She did not say no. She had promised not to lie. Toby nodded. He picked up his book. He did not read it, but he held it, and she did not push. The trouble she had not accounted for arrived on a Friday, 10 days before the scheduled hearing, in the form of 3 men from the Callaway Creek border the ranchers to the north and west of Red Mesa, whose cattle had been involved in the boundary dispute that Darius had ridden to resolve. They arrived not at the main gate, but at the bunkhouse, which meant someone had arranged their visit in a way that kept it out of Horace's formal knowledge. Darius met them there. She found out about the meeting that evening, again at the corral fence, while the light went orange over the western ridge. Frank Pell and 2 others, Darius said. They came to tell me Bellweather approached them last week. Asked them to testify at the hearing about the boundary dispute. He's framing it as evidence of my recklessness, riding into a contested territory without authorization, negotiating without legal standing, creating liability for the ranch. She stared. He's taking the thing you handled peacefully and turning it into evidence against you. He needs me to look like a liability, Darius said. Not just a bad guardian. A dangerous employee. A man who acts without sanction and costs his employer. He paused. If Carver can make the case that I'm a loose element who can't be controlled, the guardianship argument follows naturally. How could a court put 2 children in the care of a man that even his employer can't manage? What did Pell say when Bellweather approached him? Pell told him he'd think about it. Darius's voice was flat, neutral, giving nothing. That's why they came to me. Pell wanted me to know it was happening. She processed this. Pell is not going to testify for Bellweather. No, Darius said, but Bellweather doesn't know that yet. And there are 2 other men from the border area who might. He looked out at the fence line. Men who weren't there when the cattle were sorted. Men who only heard the version Bellweather told them. Then Pell needs to talk to them. I asked him to, Darius said. He said he would. He's not a man who says things he doesn't mean. Is that enough? Darius was quiet. He put both hands on the fence rail and looked at them, large hands, works scared. the kind of hands that had spent years doing hard things in difficult places. It might not be, he said. Carver is good. Bellweather is paying him to be good. If he gets 2 or 3 men from the border dispute on that stand, and Pell's testimony doesn't land right, he stopped. I'm not a man who is good in rooms, Miss Whitfield. In a courtroom, in front of a judge, defending my own character, that is not where I am effective. She looked at him. This was the most honest thing he had said to her directly, not about Edward Marsh, not about the legal situation, but about himself. The acknowledgement of a specific limitation from a man who would clearly rather break his own arm. You don't have to be good in rooms, she said. That's what Aguilar is for. Aguilar can argue the law, he said. He can't argue my character. That has to come from someone who has seen it. She held his gaze. I told you I'd testify. I know you did. He looked back at the fence line. Bellweather is going to make it ugly for you. He has 9 years on this land and 30 years in this county. You have been here 6 weeks, 7, she said, and I have 2 eyes and a working memory. He almost said something else. She could see it, a movement at his jaw, a breath that started and didn't finish. Then he said, all right, and that was the end of the conversation and the beginning of something she couldn't fully name yet. The hearing was set for a Thursday. The Wednesday before it, Horace called Lenora into his study. She had expected this. She had been expecting it for days, the patient, managed confrontation of a man who has run out of softer options. She sat in the chair across from his desk with her hands in her lap and her expression professionally pleasant and waited. Horace looked tired. This was new. The confidence was still there, but it was load-bearing now in a way it hadn't been before you could see it working. He set his hands flat on the desk. I want to speak to you directly, he said. About tomorrow, of course, she said. You have been on this ranch for 6 weeks, he said. In that time, you have formed certain impressions of the situation, of the people involved. He paused. I understand that Reddick has spoken to you about his version of events. Mr. Reddick has spoken to me about many things, she said neutrally. His version, Horace said again, slightly more firmly. What you need to understand, Miss Whitfield, is that Darius Reddick is a man with a history of violence, a history of acting without authorization, and a personal attachment to these children that is inappropriate. He has convinced himself that he has rights in this situation that he does not legally or morally possess. She looked at him. There is a registered will that says otherwise. Horace's face tightened, just slightly. A document prepared by a man, Edward Marsh, who was very ill and not entirely in command of his judgment at the time it was written. That is what Carver will be demonstrating tomorrow. I see, she said. What I am asking you, Horace said, leaning forward very slightly, is to remember what your role is here. You were hired to teach these children, not to involve yourself in legal proceedings, not to serve as a character witness for a ranch hand who has manipulated your sympathies. He paused. If you testify tomorrow against my interests, against the welfare of this household, I cannot guarantee that your position here will continue, or that I will be able to recommend you in this territory. There it was. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Clara's wall of careful correctness. She thought about Toby holding a book he couldn't read. She thought about 14 months and a folded letter and a man at a water trough who had said not yet. Mr. Bellweather, she said, I was hired to serve the children's education. And it is my professional assessment that the most important thing I can do for Clara and Toby Marsh's future is to tell a court of law exactly what I have seen in 7 weeks on this ranch. She stood up. I appreciate your candor. I will see you in court tomorrow. She turned and walked to the door. Miss Whitfield. His voice had gone quiet in a way that was different from his usual controlled quiet. You are making an error. She opened the door. If I am, she said, it is mine to make. She went to bed that night and did not sleep well, which was honest. She lay awake, listening to the wind and going over, point by point, everything she planned to say. Everything she had witnessed. Everything she could demonstrate was fact rather than sympathy. She was not afraid, exactly, but she was very aware of the weight of the next day, the way it sat at the edge of sleep and did not let her all the way under. She was up before dawn. She dressed carefully. She went to the kitchen for coffee and found Darius already there, standing at the window with his cup, which she had come to recognize as his version of pacing. He looked at her when she came in. He looked at what she was wearing, her best dress, the dark blue one she'd brought from Philadelphia for serious occasions, and something passed through his expression that was not quite surprise. "You talked to him last night," Darius said. "He called me in," she said, pouring her coffee. And I told him I'd see him in court," she said. Darius was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He threatened your position." "Yes. And you're still—" "I'm drinking my coffee," she said, "and then I am going to a courthouse." "Yes." He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she finally looked back. He had the expression of a man who is braced for something to go wrong and found, unexpectedly, that it hasn't. It sat strangely on a face built for endurance rather than relief. "You don't owe this to me," he said. "I know that," she said. "I owe it to them." He looked at his cup.
He nodded once.
Slowly, like a man adding something to a list he keeps privately. They rode to the county courthouse in separate wagons, Darius with Aguilar, who had arrived the evening before, and Lenora in the buckboard with Gil, who had no idea what was happening and kept pointing out landmarks along the road with the cheerful irrelevance of a man who is confident today is an ordinary day. The courthouse in Mercy Wells was smaller than she'd expected, a 2-story stone building with a wide porch and the kind of worn steps that suggested years of important and ordinary business conducted in equal measure. Horace was already on the steps when they arrived, with Carver at his elbow and 2 other men she didn't recognize. He watched Darius and Aguilar climb down from their wagon with the careful expressionlessness of a man saving everything for inside. He watched Lenora climb down and walk toward the steps without looking at him, and for just a moment, something shifted in his face. She caught it from the side of her vision and filed it away. Judge Hartwell was a compact man in his 50s with wire glasses and a deliberate manner, the kind of judge who wrote everything down himself and asked questions that sounded simple and weren't. He called the proceedings to order at 9 in the morning with the businesslike brevity of a man who had run courtrooms in Dallas and was not impressed by performance. Aguilar presented the will first, clean, methodical, letting the document do the work. The registration, the witness signatures, Edward Marsh's signature, Vicente Aguilar's own notarization. He presented the certified copy he had maintained in his files and the original, which had been collected from Bellweather's property under the terms of Hartwell's preliminary order, and which Horace's attorney had contested, receiving a contest they had lost. Aguilar presented this without drama, the way a man lays down a winning hand when he's been holding it for 14 months and has learned to be patient. Carver cross-examined with precision. He challenged the circumstances of the will's creation, Edward Marsh's health, his mental state, the question of whether a man dying of fever was competent to make binding legal decisions. He had a doctor's affidavit from a physician in Galveston who had treated Marsh in his final weeks and who had documented his declining condition. This was not nothing. Lenora watched Aguilar's face while Carver presented it and saw him make a note on his pad in the careful, unhurried way of a man who anticipated the attack and has prepared his answer. Aguilar's answer was the attending physician in Red Mesa, a local doctor named Greer, who had also seen Marsh in those weeks, and who said, simply and without elaboration, that Edward Marsh had been very sick, but had been in full possession of his faculties until 4 days before his death, and that the will had been signed and witnessed 8 days before the end. Carver challenged Greer's credentials. Greer acknowledged he was a country doctor and not a specialist, and then calmly listed his 22 years of medical practice and the specific clinical reasons he had concluded Marsh was competent. Carver moved on. Then came the character testimony. Horace's side went first. Carver put up 2 men from the border area, not Frank Pell, who was seated in the gallery with his arms crossed and his face closed, but 2 ranchers who ran smaller spreads and who had heard the version of the boundary dispute that Bellweather had given them. They said what they'd been prepared to say, that Darius Reddick had ridden into a contested situation without authorization, had conducted unsanctioned negotiations with neighboring landowners, had behaved with typical disregard for the authority of his employer. One of them added, unprompted, and with the particular eagerness of a man who wants to be useful, that he'd heard Reddick had been involved in some rough business before coming to Red Mesa. Magistrate involvement. A man hurt badly enough to spend 2 weeks laid up. Hartwell let this in over Aguilar's objection, noting that it would be weighed in context. Then Carver called Horace himself. Horace testified with the smooth, organized authority of a man who has given depositions before and understands their rhythm. He spoke about his years at Red Mesa, his stewardship of the children's welfare since their parents' death, his concerns about Reddick's temperament and methods. He spoke with genuine-sounding regret, not playing the villain, playing the responsible guardian who had reluctantly had to take stock of an unstable situation. He was good. She had to admit he was good. When Aguilar cross-examined, he asked only 3 questions. When had Horace first become aware of the will? Why had he not disclosed it to the court or to Reddick in the 14 months since Edward Marsh's death? And what, precisely, was his legal basis for managing the children's estate during that period? Horace answered all 3 with practiced steadiness. But the questions left something in the room, a residue, a smell, the way smoke lingers after a fire has been put out. Then Aguilar called Darius. She had not seen Darius in a courtroom before. She had seen him in a stable at a fence line, in the dark of a pre-dawn yard, and in the specific stillness of a man managing a situation he couldn't yet control. In the courtroom he was very large and very still, and he answered Aguilar's questions in the direct, low voice of a man who does not use extra words, because he has never found them useful. He talked about Edward Marsh, about their 12 years of knowing each other, about the conversation they'd had in March of the previous year when Marsh had told him what was in the will and why. He talked about the children Clara and her reading, Toby and his horses, what they'd lost and what they still needed, and what he understood his responsibility to be. He did not make himself sound admirable. He said at one point, without Aguilar prompting it, I am not an easy man to be around. I know my history, and I know my temper, and I know the kind of trouble I've found in my life. I'm not standing here telling you I'm a suitable person because I'm pleasant. I'm standing here because Edward Marsh asked me to, and because his children need someone who isn't going anywhere. Hartwell wrote something down. Carver's cross-examination was aggressive. The magistrate incident, he pushed it hard. The unauthorized negotiations with Pell, he pushed that too. The question of Reddick's finances, his lack of education, his lack of family standing. Each push was clean and professional, and each one was trying to accomplish the same thing, to make Darius look like a man whose best quality was loyalty and whose loyalty was not enough. Darius answered everything. He didn't deflect and he didn't soften. He said, the magistrate situation was 14 years ago, and the charge was dismissed because the man I hit had already beaten 2 men smaller than him that same night, and I stopped him from doing a third. The magistrate agreed that was worth considering. He said, I rode north without formal authorization, because Bellweather wanted me to go with armed men and make a confrontation out of something that needed a conversation. I made the conversation. The cattle were sorted and the fences are being repaired, and Frank Pell shook my hand. He said, when Carver pressed on his lack of formal education, I can read, write, calculate, build, grow, track, repair, and raise 2 children who can do all of those things too. Because I've been teaching them since before anyone thought to hire a proper teacher. If that's not enough education, I don't know what the word means. Hartwell wrote something else down. Then Aguilar called Lenora. She walked to the stand, aware of Horace, watching her from the plaintiff's table, not with anger, not now, but with the specific attention of a man recalculating. She sat. Aguilar asked her to state her name and position. She did. He asked her how long she had been employed at Red Mesa Ranch. 7 weeks, she said. He asked her what she had observed of the children during that period. She talked about Clara, the precision and the intelligence and the emotional discipline of a girl carrying more than her share. She talked about Toby, the way he absorbed practical knowledge, the way he'd explain patience and trust using a horse as his example, the specific brightness of a child who was still fully himself because someone had taken care to let him be. She talked about the schoolroom and the lessons and the afternoons she had spent in the round pen learning, things she hadn't known before about animals and children, and the way knowledge moves between people who trust each other. Aguilar asked, in your professional assessment as an educator, what does the welfare of Clara and Toby Marsh require? She looked at the judge. They need someone who has already decided to stay, she said. They have already lost everything once. The worst thing that could happen to them now, educationally, emotionally, developmentally, is to be placed with people whose investment in them is connected to other interests. Children know the difference. It takes them about 20 minutes to know the difference. She paused. Clara and Toby Marsh figured out Darius Reddick in about 20 minutes, and they have trusted him without interruption since their father died. That is not nothing. That is the thing that keeps a child whole when everything else is broken. The room was quiet. Carver stood for cross-examination. He was polite. He asked how long she'd known Darius Reddick prior to joining the ranch. She said she had not known him at all. He asked whether she had formed a personal attachment that might color her professional judgment. She said that was a fair question, and that her answer was that she had formed an assessment based on 7 weeks of direct observation, which was longer than most people spent assessing anyone. He asked whether it was possible that Reddick had managed her impression deliberately that a man who understood reputation and manipulation might have presented himself advantageously. She looked at Carver, and then at Horace, and then back at Carver. If you are asking whether Darius Reddick worked to make me think well of him, she said, the answer is no. He was difficult and direct and not particularly concerned with whether I found him agreeable. The impression I formed against some resistance. She paused. That is, in my experience, the most reliable kind. Carver had nothing else. Then Frank Pell stood up from the gallery without being called and said, loudly enough that it was clear he intended to be heard, Your Honor, I'd like to speak if the court will have me. Hartwell looked at him over his glasses. Are you willing to be sworn in, Mr. Pell, Frank Pell? Yes, sir, I am, Carver objected. Aguilar counter-objected. Hartwell ruled that he would hear Pell as a voluntary witness and that Carver would have cross-examination. Pell came to the stand with his hat in his hands and his jaw set, and the contained dignity of a man who has decided he is going to say something in public because it needs to be said in public. He talked about the boundary dispute. He talked about Darius arriving alone, no guns, asking to count cattle and look at the fence damage. He talked about 4 hours of work and a handshake. He said that dispute had been building for 6 weeks, and everybody on both sides knew somebody was going to get shot eventually if it kept going. Reddick ended it in an afternoon without anybody bleeding. I don't know what you call that from a legal standpoint, but where I come from we call it good sense. He said one more thing before Carver could cut him off. He said, I have a daughter who's been without schooling since her mother died. This woman, he looked at Lenora, Miss Whitfield. She agreed to take my girl into her lessons without pay. She didn't ask about my land or my connections or what I could do for her. She just said, bring her Thursday. He put his hat back on. I thought the court should know what kind of people we're talking about. Hartwell called a recess. She sat in the hallway with Aguilar, who was quiet and composed, and Darius, who was sitting with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped and looking at the floor. Lenora sat beside him and didn't say anything. After a moment he said, without looking up, You did well in there. So did you, she said. I said too much about the magistrate thing. You said exactly enough about the magistrate thing, she said. You explained it clearly and you didn't apologize for it. That was right. He looked at his hands. Hartwell is hard to read. He writes everything down, she said. Men who write everything down are usually trying to be fair. They want the record accurate because they intend to use it. He was quiet. Then he said, very low, if this doesn't go right. It's going to go right, she said. He looked at her sideways. You don't know that. No, she said. But I know what we put in front of him, and I know what they put in front of him, and I know which one is true. She met his gaze steadily. That has to be worth something. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the courthouse floor. Edward would have put it the same way, he said. Made it sound like a fact when it was a hope. Sometimes hope is the most honest thing you've got, she said. The recess lasted 40 minutes. When Hartwell returned to the bench, the room reassembled itself in the particular tight silence of people who have said everything they can say and are now waiting for the land to settle. Hartwell looked at his notes. He looked at both tables. He took off his glasses and cleaned them and put them back on. Then he said, I have a question for the court before I make my determination. One question, and I want to hear from both sides before I rule. He looked up. He looked at the room generally, not at any specific person. The question before this court is not, ultimately, about legal documents, or past history or professional assessments. All of those things are part of my consideration, but the question I keep returning to, as I review this record, is a simpler one. He paused. Who, Judge Hartwell said, truly gives these children a home? The room went silent in a way that was different from the silence before. Carver started to speak. Hartwell held up one hand without looking at him. Not counsel, he said. I want to hear it from someone in this room who has been close enough to answer honestly. He looked at Lenora. She stood before she fully decided to stand. She was aware of Horace watching her, and Darius watching her, and Aguilar's pen going still, and the room holding its breath. She stood and she thought about Clara saying that Darius was the kind of man who stays, and about Toby learning to whistle a meadowlark call from a dead father through a living man, and about a note tucked in a shirt pocket for 14 months, because there had been no one trustworthy enough to carry it. Darius Reddick does, she said. Her voice did not waver. It was 4 simple words, and they landed in that room like something that had been waiting a long time to be said out loud, and had finally found the right moment and the right person to say them. Hartwell wrote it down. Hartwell did not rule from the bench that day. He said he needed 48 hours to review his notes and the submitted documentation before issuing a written determination. And he said it in the tone of a man who already knows what his determination will be, but intends to do the thing properly regardless. He dismissed the room at 3:30 in the afternoon, and the people in it reassembled themselves in the particular awkward fashion of individuals who have spent a day in high tension and are now suddenly without anything to push against. Horace left first. He walked out with Carver at his side, speaking in a low voice, and he did not look at Lenora or at Darius as he passed. That was its own kind of information. A man who leaves without looking has already started calculating his next position. Aguilar shook Darius's hand on the courthouse steps and said he expected the ruling by Saturday morning and that he would send word immediately. He shook Lenora's hand also and held it a moment longer than a formal handshake required and said, Edward chose well when he sent that letter. She did not entirely know how to receive that, so she thanked him and let it go. The ride back to Red Mesa was quiet. Gil drove with the cheerful obliviousness that was apparently his permanent condition, pointing out a hawk circling over the north ridge and mentioning that the creek looked higher than usual for the season. Lenora sat with her hands in her lap and watched the land go by and did not try to predict anything. Darius rode separately, on horseback, and she could see him from the wagon, a dark shape moving at a steady pace along the road's edge, not hurrying, not lagging, just present in the particular way he always was. She thought about what he'd said on the courthouse stand. I'm not standing here telling you I'm a suitable person because I'm pleasant. That had landed differently than she'd expected, not as a confession of inadequacy, but as a kind of precision, the same precision he used with the horses, with the fence line, with everything he touched. He was a man who understood that accuracy was more useful than appeal. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she had come to trust that quality more than almost anything else about him. They arrived back at the ranch in the early evening. The children were on the porch. Clara had clearly been watching the road. She was on her feet before the wagon fully stopped, her face doing the thing it did when she was working hard to look composed, too still, too controlled, every feature slightly overmanaged. Toby was behind her with both hands gripping the porch rail. Well, Clara said. Lenora climbed down from the wagon. She looked at Clara and then at Toby and she said, The judge is taking 2 days to write his decision. We don't have an answer yet. Clara's composure held. Just. But how did it go? It went well, Lenora said. Aguilar was excellent. Darius, she paused, finding the right word. Honest. He was completely honest, which was exactly right. Toby looked past her at Darius, who had dismounted and handed his horse to a ranch hand and was now walking toward the porch with his hat in his hand. Toby watched him come with the wordless, total attention of a child for whom this particular man is the fixed point around which everything else orbits. Darius stopped at the porch steps. He looked up at Toby. You feed the chestnut today, he said. Yes, Toby said. And I brushed her out. She let me do her near foreleg without pulling away. Good, Darius said. He put his hat back on. Go get cleaned up for supper. Toby didn't move for a moment. He was looking at Darius with something too large for his face to fully contain. Then he said quietly, "Are we going to be okay?" Darius looked at him. He did not say yes immediately, the way a man who wants to comfort a child would. He thought about it for a moment, visibly, and then he said, "Working on it." Toby nodded. He went inside. Clara had not moved. She was looking at Lenora with the specific assessment of a girl who is deciding how much weight to put on what she's just heard. "You testified," she said. "Not a question. Yes. What did you say?" Lenora looked at her. "I said you and your brother are children who deserve someone who has already decided to stay." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said very low, "Did anyone listen?" "The judge wrote it down," Lenora said. Something broke loose in Clara's face just for a second, just a brief slip in the composure before she caught it and steadied, and then she turned and went inside after her brother. Lenora stood on the porch steps and let the evening settle around her. Behind her she could hear Darius speaking to a ranch hand about the horses. In the kitchen, she could hear Mrs. Pruitt beginning supper. The ranch went on, as it always did, which was either reassuring or strange depending on how you were holding the waiting. The 48 hours were the longest she had spent in Texas. She taught the children on Friday as though the hearing had not happened, which was the only reasonable thing to do. Clara worked. Toby worked, mostly. They did arithmetic in the morning, and natural science in the afternoon. She had started incorporating the plant identification. Darius had taught them into a proper taxonomy lesson. Giving names and classification to things Toby already knew by instinct, and watching his face when book knowledge and practical knowledge lined up, was one of the small, reliable pleasures of those weeks. Frank Pell's daughter, Abigail, had started coming on Thursdays, and she was a quick, quiet girl of 8, who sat very straight and absorbed everything without yet being willing to admit she was enjoying it. Lenora liked her immediately. Horace stayed in his study for most of Friday. This was unusual. He had always been a man of motion moving through the ranch, checking things, talking to hands, imposing his presence on every corner of the property, the way a large piece of furniture imposes itself on a room. His stillness now had a quality she recognized, not defeat, not yet, but preparation. A man reconfiguring his position before the next engagement. On Friday evening, Darius found her in the kitchen garden. She had gone there after supper because she needed somewhere outside that wasn't the porch, where the waiting felt too exposed. She was standing at the far end of the herb rows, not doing anything useful, just standing in the last of the daylight. He came in through the garden gate without announcing himself, which she'd come to understand was not rudeness, but simply the absence of theatrical behavior. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the herb rows. "Mrs. Pruitt planted those," he said, 12 years ago. First year she was here. "They've done well," she said. "She's a stubborn woman," he said. Planted them in clay soil. Everyone told her they'd die. She watered them every day for 8 months. Lenora looked at the herbs. "Is that a metaphor?" "It's a fact about the garden," he said. But she could hear, underneath it, that it was also both. They stood there for a moment in the particular comfortable quiet that had developed between them over 7 weeks. Not the absence of things to say, but the presence of enough ease to let some things wait. She had not had many relationships in her life that contained that kind of quiet. She valued it more than she'd expected to. "If Hartwell rules against us," Darius said. "He won't," she said, "but if he does," he paused. "Aguilar says we can appeal. It would take months, maybe more than a year. In the meantime, Bellweather retains authority." He was looking at the garden, not at her. "If that happens, I want you to take the children and go." She turned to look at him. "Go where? San Antonio." "Aguilar would help you find a place. Somewhere Bellweather can't reach them easily while the appeal works through." He paused. "I would find a way to follow. But if he retains legal authority and I take them without a ruling, I'm in contempt, which ends my ability to help them at all." Darius. She waited until he looked at her. "Hartwell is going to rule for you." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're very certain for someone who's been in Texas for 7 weeks." "I'm certain because I know what I said and I know it was true, and I know Hartwell was listening," she said. "I'm certain because Frank Pell stood up without being asked. I'm certain because Aguilar has had 14 months to prepare and Carver had 3 weeks. She paused. "I'm also certain because I need to be, and sometimes that's its own kind of sufficient. He was quiet. Then he said, "My mother used to say something like that." She was surprised. He almost never spoke about his family. "What did she say?" She said, "Certainty is just faith with its working boots on." He paused. She was a practical woman. Lenora looked at him. "You've never talked about her?" "No." A pause. "She died when I was 17. She worked hard her whole life and didn't have much to show for it except me, which was not exactly a return on investment." He said this without bitterness, just a factual appraisal of a difficult arithmetic. "She would have found you funny." "Funny?" "She liked people who answered questions plainly," he said. "She had no patience for people who talked around things." She said most problems in the world come from people who won't just say what they mean. Lenora smiled, small and real. "I think I would have liked her." "She would have had opinions about you," he said. "She had opinions about everyone. She would have said you were too thin for the Texas sun, and then she would have immediately asked you 17 questions about where you came from and what you believed." "What would you have told her about me?" He looked at the garden. He was quiet for long enough that she started to think he wasn't going to answer, which was also a form of answer. Then he said, "I would have told her she was someone you could count on." She said nothing. That was, she thought, the most complete thing he could have said about a person. It was also, she was fairly certain, the most he would say in a garden at the end of a Friday when a ruling was 24 hours away, and so she let it sit where he'd put it and did not try to add to it. "Go get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's going to need you sharp." "Same to you," she said. He nodded once and went back through the garden gate. She stood there a moment longer. The evening was very still. Somewhere in the main house, she could hear Clara playing a slow, careful melody on the small upright piano Lenora hadn't known she played until last week. It was not a perfect melody. Clara hit the same wrong note twice and stopped and started the phrase again. The third time she got through it, Lenora went inside. Aguilar's message arrived at 9 the following morning. A rider from town came to the gate with a sealed envelope addressed to Darius Reddick, which was itself a statement of some kind. Darius took it, opened it at the kitchen table, with Lenora across from him and Mrs. Pruitt pointedly finding reasons to be on the far side of the room while clearly not going anywhere. He read it. His face did not change. Then he set it flat on the table and pushed it across to her. She read it. Judge Hartwell had ruled in favor of Darius Reddick's guardianship claim in full. The registered will was validated. Reddick was recognized as legal guardian of Clara and Toby Marsh. Additionally, Hartwell had ordered a formal review of Horace Bellweather's management of the Marsh estate during the period of guardianship suppression, with particular attention to any financial decisions made on behalf of the estate without proper legal authority. Aguilar had been appointed to oversee the review as the estate's acting counsel. Bellweather had 30 days to produce complete accounting. She set the letter down. She looked at Darius. He was looking at the table. His hands, flat on either side of the letter, were very still. Mrs. Pruitt said, from the far side of the kitchen, without turning around, "I'm going to make the good biscuits." Darius said, very quietly, "Mrs. Pruitt, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said, pulling out her good flour. "I'm going to." Lenora looked at Darius. He looked at her. For a moment, neither of them said anything, and the kitchen was very quiet except for Mrs. Pruitt's purposeful movements and the sound of the ranch outside going about its mourning. Then Darius pushed back his chair and stood. He walked to the hallway. He stood at the bottom of the stairs. "Clara," he said, not loudly. "Toby." Footsteps overhead. Then Clara appeared at the top of the stairs, still in her morning dress, hair not yet pinned, and behind her Toby in his socks. They came down the stairs looking at his face, reading it the way children read the faces of the people they depend on. He held up the letter. "Come read this," he said. Clara came down the last 3 steps and took the letter. She read it. She read it again. Toby pressed against her side, trying to read it with her, and she tilted it so he could see, and he read it too slower, moving his lips slightly, and then his face opened up in a way that was almost hard to look at directly. The way something coming back to life is almost painful in its vividness. Clara looked up from the letter. She looked at Darius. She said, in the voice of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and is only now setting it down. It's really done. It's really done, he said. She walked the remaining 2 steps to him and pressed her face against his chest, and he put his hand on the back of her head with the careful, deliberate tenderness of a man who is very large and very aware of it, and he held her the way a man holds something he thought he might lose. Toby, who had been watching this, turned to Lenora with the letter still in his hand. He held it out to her, then apparently decided that was insufficient, and instead wrapped both arms around her middle with the uncomplicated force of an 8-year-old who has decided that's the appropriate response to this particular moment. She put her arms around him and did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. Mrs. Pruitt, at the stove, was making a great deal of noise with her flour tin. Horace received his own notification from Hartwell's court later that morning. Lenora did not see him receive it. She was in the schoolroom with the children a lesson that was proceeding in a somewhat distracted fashion, with Toby finding it impossible to sit still, and Clara finding reasons to ask questions that led the conversation away from arithmetic when she heard the front door of the main house open and close with the particular weight of a man leaving rather than entering. She went to the window. Horace was crossing the yard toward the stable, moving with the compact, deliberate pace of a man who has received news and is processing it into action. His lawyer Carver was not with him. Carver had ridden back to Austin the previous day. Horace was alone. She watched him for a moment. She felt not sympathy exactly, but the complicated recognition that a person can be wrong in large and consequential ways and still be a person who is having a bad morning. She had not stopped believing that somewhere underneath the management and the maneuvering there was something that had started as genuine. What it had become was not that, and it had cost people who deserved better. But she did not need to hate him to know that. She returned to the arithmetic lesson. That afternoon, Horace asked to speak to Darius. They met on the porch. She could see them from the schoolroom window if she stood to the left of the frame, which she did briefly without apology. They spoke for about 20 minutes. She could not hear words. She could see posture Horace contained, but with something in the set of his shoulders that was different from before, and Darius standing with his arms loose at his sides, in the stance he used when he was listening more than talking. When she passed Darius later near the corrals, she said only, "How did that go?" "He said he'll cooperate with the estate review," Darius said. He paused. He said Edward would have made a different arrangement if he'd been thinking clearly. "And what did you say?" "I said Edward was the clearest thinking man I ever knew, and that he thought about this for years, and that his arrangement was exactly what he intended." He looked at the fence line. "Then I walked away." "Good," she said. "I didn't say it unkindly," he said. "I just said it." "That's what I meant," she said. "Good." She had expected the aftermath of the ruling to feel different, some dramatic resolution, some clear line between before and after. But the ranch did not work that way, and neither did the people on it. The following days were full of ordinary tasks and ordinary complications, and the particular work of things continuing rather than concluding. The estate review began. Aguilar's first correspondence requested full accounting of the children's inheritance, what it had been at Edward Marsh's death, what it was now, and a detailed accounting of every decision made in the interim. Horace engaged a different lawyer, quieter than Carver, to represent him in the process. The paperwork moved between offices with the grinding patience of legal procedure. What the review would find, she suspected, was not clean. She suspected Aguilar suspected the same. In the meantime, Darius had work to do. She learned about the land on a Tuesday, by accident, the way she'd learned most of the significant things about him, not from him directly, but from the accumulation of details that eventually assembled into a picture she hadn't expected. She had gone to the south boundary of Red Mesa's property to retrieve Toby, who had permission to ride in the lower pasture, and had been gone an hour longer than expected. She found him at the south fence, sitting on his horse, talking through the fence rails to a man she didn't recognize, older, gray-bearded, in working clothes, fixing a section of fence on the other side. She came up alongside Toby. The man on the other side looked up and nodded at her. He said, "You the teacher?" She said she was. He said, "Reddick's land starts about 200 yards south of here. He's had it 3 years. Bought it off the Holt family when they moved on. He gestured down the fence line. Good creek on the south end. Good pasture. House needs work, but the bones are solid. She looked at Toby. Toby had the expression of someone who has known about this for a while and has been waiting with impressive patience for someone else to find out. How long have you known? She said. Since March, Toby said. Darius took me to see it. He said he'd been saving since before I could remember, and he bought it because he needed somewhere that was his. He paused. He didn't tell me why he was telling me, but I think I understand now. She looked south, past the fence line, past the distance the old man had indicated. She could see the line of cottonwoods that meant water. She could see, faint with distance, the roofline of a house. He had been building toward this for years, not waiting to find out whether he'd win the hearing, and then deciding he'd built his exit before there was certainty, because he was not a man who waited for certainty before doing the necessary work. She went back to the ranch and found him at the stable. She said, "Why didn't you tell me about the land?" He looked at her. He didn't look surprised that she knew. Because it wasn't relevant to the legal situation, he said. It tells me something about how you think, she said. That's relevant. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I bought it because I knew if I won guardianship and stayed at Red Mesa, Bellweather would make it impossible. Every day. He'd find ways to make my position untenable without violating the court's ruling. A man like Horace doesn't accept loss quietly. He just makes the environment around the loss as difficult as he can. He looked at the stable floor. I needed somewhere that was mine, where I could take the children that was nobody's property but my own. And the house? Needs work, he said, a lot of work. Show me, she said. He looked at her. Now? Unless you're busy. He was not busy. They rode south on 2 horses. Lenora, on the steady bay mare she'd been using since her 2nd week, and came to a gate in the fence line she hadn't known existed, and went through it, and followed the fence south until the land opened into a wide, sloped pasture with good grass and, yes, a creek running along the southern edge with cottonwoods shading both banks. The house sat on a rise, a solid structure, stone foundation, 2 floors, wide porch that wrapped the front and one side, windows that needed new glass in places and new wood around the frames. She got off the horse and stood looking at it. The foundation is sound, Darius said, coming up beside her. The roof needs reshingling on the east end. The porch boards are mostly good except the south corner where the drainage goes wrong. He paused. Kitchen is large. Back room off the kitchen was used as a study. 4 rooms upstairs. She was quiet for a moment. Enough room, she said. Enough room for 2 children, he said. Yes. She looked at the creek. She looked at the pasture. She looked at the cottonwoods that were very green in the April light. She said, You need help with the roof. I have men, he said. Pete Odom said he'd come on Sundays. 2 of the other hands offered. Ranch hands from Red Mesa? She looked at him. They volunteered? Apparently, he said, with the slight awkward quality of a man receiving something he didn't know how to accept. Pete said he'd been waiting 9 years to see how things landed, and now they'd landed, and the least he could do was shingle a roof. She laughed, actually laughed. The second time in recent memory that he'd said something that produced without trying. He looked at her with the slightly startled expression he always had when that happened, like laughter was a weather event he hadn't predicted. What? He said. 9 years, she said. He's been waiting 9 years. And the least he could do is shingle a roof. She shook her head. Do you understand how much people see you that you don't know they see? He looked away. I don't put much stock in what people see, he said. I've seen what that's worth. I know, she said. But Pete Odom is coming on Sundays. That's worth something. He didn't argue. He stood with her at the rise, looking at the house, and the pasture and the creek and the cottonwoods. And neither of them said the obvious thing that was present in all of it, the shape of a future that was not yet stated, but was visible the way the creek was visible, clear and running. The work on the house began the following Sunday. Pete Odom arrived with 2 other hands and a wagon of roofing materials before 8 in the morning. Darius was already there. Lenora came with the children because Toby had asked 17 times and Clara had asked once, but in a way that communicated 11 times. Abigail Pell came too, because her father brought her when he came to see if there was anything useful he could do, which there was. It was not an efficient workday. There were too many people doing things they weren't trained for, and Darius had to redo one section of roofing that Pete had gotten wrong. And Toby fell off the porch rail twice trying to climb to the roofline before Lenora assigned him the permanent task of handing up materials from below, which was important and also kept him on the ground. Clara, who had not expected to have opinions about houses, turned out to have strong opinions about which room should be the schoolroom, and spent an hour measuring windows with a piece of string and taking notes. Frank Pell fixed the drainage problem on the south porch corner in an hour and a half, which made him Darius's favorite person of the day by a significant margin. Late in the afternoon, when the roof section was done and the porch boards were at least assessed if not yet repaired, and everyone was tired in the good way of people who have done actual work, Lenora was sitting on the porch steps with a cup of water when Darius came and sat on the step below her. He leaned his elbows on his knees and looked out at the pasture where Toby was running with Abigail Pell, and Clara was watching them with the particular expression of an 11-year-old who is too old to run like that, but wishes she weren't. Aguilar sent word this morning, he said. The estate review found what we expected. Bellweather redirected income from 2 of the properties in the Marsh estate toward Red Mesa's operational costs over the past 14 months. He'll have to make it right. Will he? He doesn't have a choice, Darius said. The court order is specific and Aguilar is precise. He paused. It won't restore everything. Some of it's already spent in ways that are hard to unwind. But it'll be enough for the children to have real choices when they're older. She nodded. Clara will go to university, she said. I'm nearly certain. I know, he said. She's going to leave someday and take about half the county's common sense with her. Lenora smiled. And Toby's going to stay, Darius said. He already knows it. He just doesn't know he knows it. He looked at the boy running in the pasture. He's going to be a good rancher. She looked at the side of his face. The scar along his jaw, the lines at the corner of his eye from years of squinting into open country. The particular still quality that was not stiffness, but something more like depth, a man who had more going on inside than he would ever put in words, and who had learned, somewhere along the way, to be all right with that. She thought about what she had said in the courtroom, someone who has already decided to stay. She thought about what Clara had said before that. He was the kind of man who stays. She thought about Philadelphia and the cramped classroom and the $11.40 in her coin purse, and the particular quality of a life that has been competent and purposeful and not yet complete. This is a good piece of land, she said. Yes, he said. The creek is useful. Runs most of the year, he said. Dry in August sometimes, but not always. She looked at the pasture. Room for a garden on the east side, she said. Good angle for morning light. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, You're thinking about the east side. I'm a practical person, she said. I notice these things. He was quiet for longer this time. She could feel him thinking, the way you can feel weather coming not yet arrived, but already present in the atmosphere. He said, I don't know how to do this. Do what? This. A pause. Ask someone for something like this. She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the pasture, at the children, at the creek, at anywhere that was not directly at her, and she could see clearly that this was not cowardice, but a specific difficulty. The difficulty of a man who has spent his whole life being sufficient unto himself, and is now standing at the edge of something that requires him to be otherwise. Darius, she said. He looked at her. She held his gaze. I'm not going back to Philadelphia, she said. I decided that about 2 weeks ago. He was very still. I don't know what you want to ask, she said, but I am telling you that whatever it is, the answer is yes, and you should probably say it before Clara comes back with opinions about where the schoolroom windows should face. Something happened in his face, a slow unwinding, like a knot worked loose after being tight for a long time. And underneath it, something that she would have called hope if it hadn't also been relief and terror, and the particular brightness of a man hearing something he had told himself not to count on. He stood. He turned toward her. He reached into his shirt pocket, which she had not seen him reach into before, and took out a small ring simple gold, with a single pearl set in an unelaborate band. He held it between 2 fingers and looked at it for a moment, like a man confirming a thing is real before he trusts it. This was my mother's, he said. It's the only thing I have of hers. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. He went down on one knee on the porch step below her, which put him at approximately her eye level, and he looked at her directly with those gray eyes that held still even when everything else was moving. "I am not an easy person," he said. "You have seen 7 weeks of evidence of that, so I'm not going to pretend otherwise." He paused. "But I am the kind of man who stays. And if you will have me, if you will stay here with me and with those 2 children who need the both of us, which I think they do, and which I think you know they do, then I will do everything in my power to deserve it." He held out the ring. She looked at him for a long moment, this large, scarred, difficult, utterly reliable man who had never asked anyone for help in his life and had just gotten all the way to the end of the most important question he would ever ask without once dressing it up into something it wasn't. She reached out and took the ring from his hand. "Yes," she said. Obviously, yes. He looked at her, then he looked at the ring in her hand. Then he stood, which took a moment because his knee was not particularly comfortable on a porch step, and she almost said something about that and decided this was not the moment. From the pasture, Toby's voice carried up in a shout, "Clara, look, I can almost reach the branch." Clara's voice, clearly and without warmth, "Don't you dare." A pause. "I'm not doing it," Toby said. "I'm just saying I almost could." Darius looked at the pasture. Then he looked at Lenora. The almost smile was back the small corner of the mouth adjustment that was his version of a full expression. "Sufficient unto himself," he said. "That boy. He learned it from somewhere," she said. He looked at her. "I suppose he did." The sun was going down behind the western ridge, doing what Texas sunsets do, going enormous and orange and completely without restraint, spreading across the sky like it has nowhere else to be and all the time in the world. It lit the pasture and the creek and the cottonwoods and the half-repaired house, and Pete Odom came around the corner from the roofline hauling his tools and stopped when he saw them standing together on the porch and looked at the ring on Lenora's hand and said nothing at all, just turned back around and went to put his tools in the wagon, and she could hear him whistling as he went. She looked down at her hand, at the simple golden pearl ring that had belonged to a practical woman who planted herbs in clay soil and watered them every day for 8 months. She thought, yes, obviously. They were married on a Saturday in October, when the heat had finally relented enough that standing outside for an hour did not feel like a punishment, and the light came in low and amber across the pasture, in the way that Texas light does, in autumn less aggressive than summer, more considered, like it has learned something about patience. The ceremony was held on the repaired porch of the house on Darius's land, which was no longer half finished. The roof was solid. The porch boards were replaced. The drainage on the south corner ran clean. The east side garden that Lenora had noticed the afternoon of the proposal had been dug, planted, and was already producing more mint than anyone could use, which Mrs. Pruitt said was the sign of a house that intended to stay. There was no grand occasion made of it. Lenora had not wanted elaborate, and Darius would not have known how to produce it if she had. A justice of the peace came from Mercy Wells. Frank Pell and his daughter Abigail came. Pete Odom came, wearing a collar that was clearly uncomfortable and that he adjusted every 4 minutes. Vicente Aguilar made the ride from San Antonio, which was not a short ride, and stood in the back with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who is filing this moment away alongside everything else Edward Marsh had ever asked him to witness. And the children. Clara stood beside Lenora in a dress she had helped choose dark green, practical enough that she'd clearly been thinking about wearing it past the occasion. She held a small bunch of late-season wildflowers that Toby had gathered that morning with more enthusiasm than skill, and she held them carefully, with the particular dignity of a girl who understood exactly what this day meant, and had decided to let herself mean it alongside it. Toby stood beside Darius in a clean shirt that had already come partly untucked by the time the justice of the peace arrived, and he stood very straight in the way of a boy making a conscious effort. And when the moment came when Darius and Lenora turned toward each other, and the justice of the peace began, Toby reached out and took Darius's hand without thinking about it, the way children do when they are feeling something too large for their body and need somewhere to put it. Darius looked down at him. He did not say anything. He held the boy's hand. She would remember that, afterward, longer than she remembered the words of the ceremony. Longer than she remembered anything else about the day. The vows were plain. Darius said his without embellishment, in the same direct voice he used for everything, not flat, but unornamented, which was its own kind of dignity. Lenora said hers and felt, partway through, the particular unsteadiness of genuine emotion that she had been prepared for and that arrived anyway, and she let it arrive, because she had come to understand, in the months since Philadelphia, that steadiness and feeling are not opposites. When it was done, Pete Odom started clapping before the justice of the peace had fully finished the last sentence, and Frank Pell laughed, and Abigail Pell looked at Toby and said, "Is this what a wedding is?" And Toby said, with 7-year-old authority that had not diminished over the months, "I think so. I've never been to one before either." Mrs. Pruitt, who had driven out from Red Mesa with a wagon of food that could have fed 3 times the people present, said nothing at all. She just went to the kitchen and began serving. Horace did not come. Nobody had expected him to. But 3 days before the wedding, a letter had arrived at the house addressed to Darius, not to Lenora, not to the children, but to Darius specifically, in Horace's careful, old-fashioned hand. Darius had read it alone and then told her, that evening, what it said. It was not an apology exactly. Horace was not apparently a man who could fully construct an apology. It said that he had been wrong about the guardianship, and that he was cooperating fully with Aguilar's estate review, and that he understood his position regarding the children's finances had been, and this was the word Horace used. Darius said, the one that cost him something improper. And then it said one more thing. It said, Edward was my oldest friend, and I told myself for 14 months the traits I was protecting his children's future. I can see now that I was protecting my own arrangements and calling it the same thing. I am not certain I can correct that in myself, but I am aware of it, which is perhaps where correction begins. She had thought about that for a long time. The particular quality of a man who can see himself clearly at the end, even if he could not manage it when it would have mattered. She did not forgive him in any simple sense. Forgiveness was too large a word for something that required more distance than a few months. But she held the letter with something that was not quite forgiveness and not quite compassion, and was perhaps just the acknowledgement that human beings are consistently, frustratingly capable of being both worse and better than the worst and best things they've done. The estate review concluded in December. Aguilar sent his summary in a letter that ran 12 pages and that Darius read twice and summarized for her as Bellweather redirected $1,100 from the Marsh estate over 14 months. The remaining estate is sound. The children's inheritance, once Bellweather's improper redirections are restored, will be sufficient for Clara's higher education and for Toby to have a working start in ranching, if that's the path he chooses. Horace paid back every dollar without contesting the order, which was, as Aguilar noted in a brief personal note appended to his legal summary, the most honest thing he had done in 14 months. Lenora read that note and thought, it took a court order, but still, the school came next. The idea had been forming since before the wedding, since the Thursday lessons with Abigail Pell had made clear that the need in this county was wider than one ranch and 2 children. She raised it with Darius in January, on a cold morning when the creek had gone low, and the pasture grass was brown, and the house was warm inside in the particular way of a house, with good walls and a working stove. There are children within 15 miles of this house who haven't had regular schooling in 2 or 3 years, she said. Some of them have never had it. He was at the kitchen table with a ledger. He didn't look up. How many? Frank Pell knows of 4 families immediately, she said. There are probably more if anyone asks. He turned a page of the ledger. You'd need another room. The back room off the kitchen, she said. It's large enough for 8 children if we arrange it right. It already gets good light. 8 children, he said. To start. He looked up at her. He had the expression he got when he was doing calculations that weren't in the ledger, the assessing, patient look of a man working out whether something is possible before he lets himself decide whether to want it. We don't have money for a second teacher, he said. I know, she said. I'm not asking for a second teacher. I'm asking for 8 children in the back room. He looked back at the ledger. He turned another page. He said the Garrity family, 6 miles east. They have 3 children. The father came by in November asking about pasture lease. He mentioned his oldest girl is 13 and hasn't had any schooling since they moved out from Dallas 2 years ago. She waited. I'll talk to him, Darius said, and to 2 other families I know of. If you've got 4 from Pell, that's a beginning. That's a school, she said. He looked up at her. Let's call it a beginning, he said, and see what it becomes. It became by spring a room with 9 children ranging from 6 to 13, meeting 4 days a week, which was as much as the farming families could spare their children during planting season, and which Lenora accepted because half a week of school was categorically better than none. Clara sat in on lessons when she wasn't doing her own advanced work. Lenora had started giving her university-level reading in mathematics and natural science, because it was clear that Clara's trajectory was already set, and the only question was how far, and Clara turned out to be an unexpected asset with the younger students, particularly the ones who were embarrassed about gaps in their learning. Clara had no patience for embarrassment. She just handed children books and told them to start from where they were. Toby, who was 9 now, and had the manner of a boy who has absorbed competence from the ground up, helped Darius with an unofficial second curriculum: horses, fence work, water management, the practical knowledge of how to make land do what you need it to do. 2 of the school children's fathers had started stopping by on Saturday mornings, ostensibly to check on their children's progress. Actually, to talk with Darius about cattle and fence and the drainage problem along the creek road that had been causing everyone grief since the last wet spring. These conversations turned, gradually and without formal arrangement, into something resembling a cooperative 4 ranching families, sharing labor and information and occasionally equipment in ways that made each of their operations slightly more viable than it had been alone. Frank Pell started calling it Reddick's operation, which Darius objected to and Pell ignored. "You're building something," Pell told him one Saturday, standing at the fence line with his coffee. "Whether you put your name on it or not, people can see what it is." "I'm fixing a fence," Darius said. "You're fixing a fence and running a school and settling a water dispute and raising 2 children, Pell said. "Some men spend their whole lives not doing one of those things properly. I'm allowed to put your name on it." Darius did not have an answer for that, which Lenora, who was near enough to overhear, found quietly satisfying. The water dispute Pell mentioned was the one that had been building along the South Creek boundary for 2 seasons, 3 ranches drawing from the same creek system, the water running lower each dry month. Nobody wanting to formalize an arrangement, because formalizing meant acknowledging limitation, which ranchers in that county treated as a moral failing rather than a fact of hydrology. Darius had been watching it since before the guardianship hearing, the same way he'd watched the North Boundary cattle issue, with the patient attention of a man who understands that problems left alone do not resolve, they compound. He brought the 3 ranching families together in February, at the house, around the kitchen table that was too small for everyone. And so they ended up spread into the back room and the hallway. And he put a hand-drawn map of the creek system on the table and said, "The creek runs about 70% of what it ran 5 years ago. In August, it's going to run 40% of what it ran 5 years ago. That is a fact of the land, and it's not going to change by anyone wanting it to." He paused. "We can fight over what's left and everyone comes out worse, or we can agree on who draws what and when and come out with enough." One of the ranchers, a man named Dorset, who ran the westernmost spread, said, "What gives you the right to call this meeting?" "I own land on this creek," Darius said. "Same as you. That's what gives me the right." Dorset looked at the map. He looked at the other men. He said, "All right, let's hear it." The agreement that came out of that meeting was not elegant. It was the kind of agreement that works because everyone leaves slightly unhappy with it, which is the signature of a fair outcome. Lenora wrote it up in clear, numbered language, and each family signed a copy. Aguilar reviewed it and said it was legally enforceable if anyone wanted to take it that route, which nobody did, because by the time he reviewed it, the ranchers had already been operating under its terms for 3 weeks and finding it livable. "You know what you did," she told Darius that evening. "You prevented a range war. I drew a map and made coffee," he said. "You did it before too," she said, "with Pell, before the hearing. You rode up there alone and sorted cattle and fixed a fence, and everyone else was ready to send men with guns." He was quiet for a moment. "Guns make things permanent," he said. "I've seen what permanent looks like. It doesn't help anyone." He looked at his hands. Edward used to say that most fights are just failures of arithmetic two people who both think they're getting less than their share, but haven't sat down to figure out what the actual shares are. She looked at him. He sounds like he was a wise man. He was the smartest man I ever knew, Darius said. Smarter than he looked, which he used to say was an advantage. A pause. He also burned every meal he ever cooked, couldn't keep accounts to save his life, and once spent a week convinced he'd seen a mountain lion in the north pasture that turned out to be a large dog. She laughed. He almost smiled. He was a real person, he said. That's what I miss most, I think. He was completely inconveniently real. She thought about that for a long time afterward, the particular quality of being completely inconveniently real. The ways in which the people who had mattered most in her own life had been real in exactly that fashion her mother, who was sharp-tongued and warm in equal measure, and who had told Lenora at 16 that the worst thing a woman could do was make herself smaller to make other people more comfortable. Her first supervising teacher, who was brilliant and chaotic, and once lost an entire class's arithmetic papers and blamed it on a draft. Edward Marsh, who she had never met but knew. Through the people he had shaped a man who burned every meal and saw phantom mountain lions, and had the sense to write a letter that found its way to the right person 14 months after he was gone. Real people are inconvenient. They are inconsistent and flawed, and they make strange decisions, and they leave things unfinished, and they trust you with their children when they're running out of time. And the ones who are worth knowing, the ones who stay, or who teach you how to stay, or who make it possible to stay, they are worth every inconvenient, imperfect, genuine thing about them. She thought she had come to Texas to teach children. She had, in fact, come to Texas to learn that the judgment she'd arrived with, the careful, distance-maintained, evidence-based judgment she'd built over 27 years of managing her own small life with professional precision was good as far as it went. But it had one significant limitation. It only worked if you were willing to apply it to yourself as honestly as you applied it to anyone else. She had applied it to Darius. She had been willing to observe before judging. She had been willing to let evidence accumulate. She had been willing to say, in a courtroom, in front of everyone, what she actually believed. She had not, until Texas, been willing to apply the same standard to what she herself needed. The lonely competence of a woman who is good at her work and tells herself that is sufficient. The careful life that fits within its edges and does not require anything it cannot deliver. She had told herself this was maturity. She had told herself it was self-sufficiency. It was, she understood now, a simpler and less flattering thing. It was fear of the cost of wanting something real. Real things can be lost. Real things require real risk. She had walked into a courtroom and said 4 words in front of a judge and meant every one of them. And then she had stood on a porch step and taken a ring from a man's hand and said yes, and meant that too, not because she had conquered her fear, but because the thing she was choosing mattered more than the fear did. She thought that was perhaps the only version of courage that actually works, not the absence of fear, but the presence of something more important than it. 2 years after the wedding, Reddick Ranch School had 16 students. It was not an official school in any governmental sense. There was no charter, no county funding, no formal inspection, but it ran with the regularity and the seriousness of one. And the families who sent their children did not need a charter to understand what it was giving them. 3 of the original 9 students had reached levels of competency in reading and arithmetic that Lenora would have been satisfied by in her Philadelphia classroom. One of them, a 12-year-old girl named Rosa Garrity, the one Darius had mentioned, the one who hadn't had schooling, since Dallas turned out to have a mathematical intuition that Lenora had not encountered before in a student, the kind of raw facility that doesn't come from instruction, but from some fundamental orientation toward number and pattern. She wrote about Rosa to a contact at a women's college in San Antonio. The contact wrote back with interest. She showed the letter to Darius. He read it. He said, "She'll need money for the application fees." "I know," Lenora said. "I can manage it," he said. Darius, "She's not our child. She's a child who needs an application fee," he said. "That's not complicated." He handed the letter back. "Write to your contact." She wrote to her contact. Rosa Garrity's father, when told, sat at the kitchen table for 5 minutes without speaking. Then he said, I moved my family out of Dallas because I went broke and I was ashamed of it. I came out here because I thought at least we could work the land and make something." He paused. I didn't expect. He stopped. He looked at Lenora and then at Darius. "I don't know how to say what I mean." "You don't have to," Lenora said. "I know I don't," he said. "I want to." He found the words eventually. They were imperfect words, halting in places, and he repeated himself twice, and at the end his voice was not entirely steady. They were also completely honest words. Lenora thought that was more than most people managed. Clara left for San Antonio in the autumn of the second year. She had been accepted at a women's college. On the strength of her work, Lenora had written the recommendation herself, and she had not exaggerated a single thing because she had not needed to. Clara packed efficiently and without ceremony, which was entirely in character, and on the morning she left, she stood at the gate with her trunk and shook Darius's hand formally, which made him look briefly startled. And then she hugged Lenora for a long time without saying anything. "Right," Lenora said. "Every week," Clara said. "You know I will. I have opinions about everything, and someone has to receive them." "Send them to your brother," Lenora said. "He needs the practice reading long letters." Clara laughed. She climbed into the wagon. She looked back once from the road, not with sadness, but with the particular brightness of a girl looking at something she loves and is ready to leave, which is its own kind of maturity. Toby watched the wagon until it was gone. Then he said, "To nobody in particular, she's going to run something someday." "Probably something important," "Probably," Darius said. "She's going to be insufferable about it," Toby said. "Most certainly," Darius said. They were both quiet for a moment. Then Toby said, "I'm going to check the south fence." Pete said there was a post that needed resetting. "I'll come with you," Darius said. They walked off toward the south pasture together, the large man and the boy who was growing into his shoulders, moving at an easy pace, not talking, just present in the side-by-side way of people who have spent enough time together that silence is its own form of conversation. Lenora watched them go. She thought about Edward Marsh, who had known in 20 minutes. She thought about the 20 minutes she had spent in the yard of Red Mesa Ranch on that first morning, watching a large shape through the corrals and hearing through an open window the words that she had answered instead of ignoring. She thought about how many of the significant things in a life happen in moments that do not announce themselves as significant, the letter you pick up and put back down, the question you almost don't ask, the door you very nearly decide not to walk through. She had almost decided not to take this job. Philadelphia had had other possibilities, smaller and safer, that would not have required stagecoach travel and starting over in a territory she didn't know. She had taken it because the advertisement had interested her and because she had told herself she was not the kind of person who chose the safer option out of fear, and she had half believed herself and half been lying. And the truth of it was she had gotten on the stage to Texas, not because she was brave, but because the life she had was not quite enough, and she knew it, and she needed to go somewhere. She didn't already know the shape of things. She had not expected Red Mesa. She had not expected Clara or Toby or Mrs. Pruitt or Frank Pell or Pete Odom on Sundays with his too-tight collar, shingling a roof for a man he'd been quietly watching for 9 years. She had not expected a kitchen garden with more mint than anyone could use, or a creek that ran low in August, or a water agreement written in plain numbered language around a table that was too small for everyone. She had not expected Darius Reddick. She had expected she understood this now to find someone she needed to change. Someone rough who needed polish, someone wild who needed taming, someone whose reputation and reality were the same thing and would confirm everything she had been sent west to confirm. She had expected to do the familiar work of a woman who enters a difficult situation and makes it better through competence and patience and the quiet authority of someone who knows how things should be done. What she had found instead was a man who was already doing the work, had been doing it for years, and who needed not to be changed but to be seen, not fixed, witnessed, given the particular thing that is harder to give than help the honest attention of someone who will look at what is actually there and not at what they expected to find. She thought this was perhaps the thing nobody tells you about taming, that the word itself is the mistake, that the impulse to tame, to smooth, to correct, to manage it comes from the same place as the impulse to control, and it costs the same thing, which is accuracy. The truth of who a person is, arrived at by actual observation rather than by prior conclusion. She had arrived at Red Mesa with a prior conclusion. She had revised it. She was glad every day that she had revised it. There is a version of strength that is really just defense wearing a confident face. The strength that won't ask for help, won't admit need, won't let anyone close enough to matter, because mattering introduces the possibility of loss. She had lived in that version of strength for most of her adult life, and she had mistaken its tidiness for health. The other kind of strength, the kind that goes to a courthouse and says 4 words into the silence of a room, that kind is not tidy. It is inconvenient and expensive, and it requires you to be wrong sometimes, and to have been wrong, and to keep going anyway. That kind of strength, she had learned, is the only kind that builds anything worth having. The school grew. The water agreement held. The South Creek ran adequately through August, which was not a miracle but was the result of 3 ranching families agreeing on arithmetic before the dry months arrived, which Lenora thought was close enough. Rosa Garrity's application was accepted, and her father, when the letter came, said the same thing twice and couldn't finish either time, and nobody in the room minded. Clara wrote every week. Her letters were long and opinionated, and full of detailed assessments of her professors, her fellow students, the curriculum, the city, the food, and the particular quality of women who were choosing to build a life through knowledge in a world that had not entirely agreed to let them. The letters were funny and serious by turns, and they revealed to anyone paying attention the full shape of a mind that had been given room to grow and had taken the offer completely. Toby reset the south fence post and moved on to the next problem, and then the one after that, in the manner of a boy becoming a man through the accumulation of necessary things done properly. He was not as quick as Clara, but he was thorough, and he had a quality that she had seen in his guardian, and nowhere else, the ability to stay with a difficult thing until it resolved, not by force but by patient, consistent presence. The lambs responded to that, the way the chestnut mare had responded to it, the way most living things respond to it eventually. People still told stories about Darius Reddick in the county. The stories had not disappeared. The feared foreman, the man who could silence a bunkhouse, the one whose reputation arrived in a room before he did. Some of those stories were accurate. Some were exaggerated. Most of them were not wrong about what he had been. They were simply incomplete about what else he had been all along. They told new stories too now. The water agreement. The school in the back room. The orphan children raised in a house that was half built when they arrived and solid by the time they needed it most. The fence problems solved before they became range wars. The Saturday mornings that had turned, without anyone quite deciding to, into something that held a small piece of the county together. He was still not easy. He was still direct to the point of bluntness and slow to explain himself and entirely uninterested in being liked by people he didn't respect. He still moved through a room like someone who has measured the space and found it sufficient and requires nothing further from it. He still sat at the kitchen table in the early morning, before anyone else was up, with his coffee and his ledger, and the particular stillness of a man whose internal weather you have to know him very well to read. She knew it now. She could tell, across a room, across a yard, across the specific distance, that 12 months of marriage and 2 years of building, something put between 2 people, she could tell what he was thinking and what he was not saying, and when something was sitting heavy, and when he was simply quiet for good reasons. She thought, this is the thing itself. The ordinary weight of knowing someone accumulated over days and months, the way creek silt accumulates, not dramatic, not announced, just present and increasing and eventually substantial. It was enough. She had come to understand exactly the right amount. On a Thursday morning in the 3rd autumn, Lenora stood at the window of the back room that had become the school, watching 9 children work at their tables. Rosa Garrity's younger brother was puzzling through an arithmetic problem with the same quiet focus that Rosa had shown before she left, which made Lenora write a note to herself. Abigail Pell, who was 10 now and had gone from silent wariness to bossy competence in 2 years, was explaining punctuation to the 6-year-old beside her with the authoritative patience of someone who has recently learned the thing herself and is very invested in sharing the information. Toby was outside the window, visible in passing, moving toward the stable with the easy purpose of a boy who knows where he belongs. She looked at all of it. She thought about the school teacher who had arrived at Red Mesa Crossing with $11.40 and 2 rolled certificates, and the professional certainty that she knew what she was walking into. She thought about what that woman had understood and what she had not yet understood, and the specific distance between those two things, a distance that turned out to require Texas to cross, and a man she had been told was the meanest in the county, and a kitchen garden, and a courthouse in Mercy Wells, and a ring that had belonged to a practical woman who knew how to plant things in difficult soil. She had been sent west to tame a wolf. She had found instead a man who had spent 9 years doing the hardest kind of work, the invisible kind, the kind that doesn't get recorded in ledgers or recognized at county meetings, the kind that consists of staying, when staying is the last thing anyone expects, of protecting what you promised to protect, even when no one is watching, of being, in the language of a dead man's letter written 3 days before the end, the kind of person someone can trust. She had not tamed him. The word had never been right, and she had known it by the end of her first week. You don't tame a person who is already doing what they should be doing. You don't fix a person who is already, in the ways that matter, whole. What you can do, what she had done, what he had let her do, what they had done together in the accumulating ordinary weight of 3 years, is recognize, is witness, is say out loud, in front of whoever needs to hear it, this is what is actually here. Not the legend, not the reputation, not the version that is easier to manage or more convenient to maintain. The thing itself. She turned back to the room. Abigail Pell had moved on to explaining something about vowels. The younger Garrity boy had solved his arithmetic and was looking at her for confirmation. She walked toward him, crossing the room in the good morning light, doing the work she had come to do. Outside, the creek ran, the fence line held. The cottonwoods, which were old and indifferent to the weather, stood along the south bank the way they had stood before any of these people arrived and would stand after they were gone, which was either sobering or reassuring, depending on the day. On this day, she found it reassuring. She had planted something in difficult soil. She was watering it every day. She intended to keep watering it for as long as she had the means to do so, which she expected, with reasonable certainty, to be a very long time. That, she thought, was enough. That was, in fact, everything.